ERP implementations are complex undertakings that require a lot of finesse and hard skills. What exactly are those hard skills and those soft skills you need to know to make your ERP software implementation successful? That's what we're going to discuss here in a deep dive training course here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation and ERP implementations. We help clients with all sorts of ERP implementations, ranging from SAP and Oracle and Microsoft to potentially lesser-known systems like Infor, Epicor, etc. And we work with a lot of different software implementations, a lot of different project teams, a lot of different industries. And what we wanted to do here today is provide a training course that goes deep into understanding what the different ERP systems are in the marketplace, what it takes to make those ERP implementations successful, how to understand the change management and the risks and failure points of implementations, as well as some case studies so that we can understand what not to do as well as what to do during our implementations. So this training course is meant to be a deep dive into understanding ERP systems and ERP implementations. This is going to be relevant whether you're a project team member going through an ERP implementation for the first time, whether you're trying to brush up on your skills, whether you're a consultant, whether you're an executive team member trying to figure out what exactly you should know about ERP systems and what understanding you need to have before embarking on an implementation. So this is meant to be a deeper dive than a lot of the videos you'll find on my YouTube channel. I encourage you to share this training material and this training video with anyone else on your team that you think might benefit from this and your overall project team and your colleagues as well. Now, for more information, if you're looking for more best practices and more supplementary material to this training course, I encourage you to read our annual digital transformation report. It's a report we publish each year that goes through a number of independent reviews and rankings of different ERP systems, as well as providing a number of best practices and tips to help organizations be more successful with their implementations. You can read and download that paper for free by scanning the QR code in front of you, or you can go to the links below. And if you want to go even deeper than this white paper that we share with you for free, I also encourage you to read my new book called The Final Countdown. It's a book that I published in 2023 that talks about digital strategy, ERP projects, and how to be successful in those implementations. And it shares my 25 years of experience with helping clients through their ERP implementations. You can read that book by scanning the QR code in front of you, or you can just go to thefinalcountdown.com. Now, the way we've broken up this training session here today is we've broken it into a number of different modules, and you can see the agenda here in front of you. We're going to start off by talking about ERP software in general. This is especially helpful if you haven't yet chosen an ERP system, or if you're still trying to figure out and narrow down what system or systems might be the best fit for your organization. Once we've done that, we'll dive into implementation planning, the implementation itself, organizational change, basically everything you need to know about how to implement ERP systems effectively. And then we'll get into some case studies. We'll talk about ERP failures and some of the lessons from them, as well as successful ones and some of the lessons we can take away from organizations that have been successful in their ERP implementations. First, it helps to understand what exactly ERP software is. So let's start off by giving a quick high-level overview before we dive into specific software vendors and ways to implement the system. We'll start off with this basic foundational understanding to start. ERP software, or enterprise resource planning software, has been around for a long time. It's helped a lot of organizations improve and become more effective and efficient. But what exactly is ERP software? I'm going to give that answer here today. I've been in the ERP software space now for over 20 years. And whenever I'm talking to family or students or someone who's not familiar with the ERP space that I'm in, people often ask, what in the world is ERP and what does that mean? I mentioned that ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. And ERP is actually an evolution from some older technology that was really originated with a lot of manufacturing organizations. And that software was called MRP, Material Resource Planning. So the origin of MRP came to be when a lot of larger manufacturing organizations were finding that they were struggling with managing their entire manufacturing operations. They had trouble tracking customer orders and tracking demand, tracking what kind of parts and supplies they would need to purchase to be able to meet and fulfill customer demand. So MRP systems were a way to handle that. It was a way to manage the tracking of what supplies and raw materials we might need to manufacture for our customers, It was a way to manage the manufacturing shop floor so that we could prioritize orders and make sure that we maximized throughput. And it was really a way to address the whole movement in the 90s toward lean manufacturing and trying to maximize manufacturing efficiency. And in the U.S., a lot of U.S. manufacturers were struggling with manufacturing efficiency and manufacturing quality, and they were being beat by Japanese manufacturing organizations at the time. So MRP systems were a way to help organizations of all origins and all nationalities to help them better become more efficient and more effective. So over time, MRP evolved and morphed into something more than just a manufacturing solution. It started to focus on warehouse management and procurement and financials and accounting, even HCM or human capital management or customer relationship management on the sales side. It took the core of MRP and started to expand in other parts of the enterprise to where organizations were moving towards single systems that could tie together the entire organization, provide one unified data set, provide a common workflow across the organization, and for lack of a better term, provide one system that provided all the operations and data and transparency into what was happening enterprise-wide. And so that's the whole evolution of how ERP came to be. It really traces its origins back decades ago when enterprise technology was first emerging. Now, there are a plethora of ERP software providers in the marketplace. The biggest ones, the ones that are most commonly used by bigger organizations, are companies like SAP. Oracle is another one. Microsoft provides its own ERP solution. Those are the three biggest ones, and a lot of organizations and industry analysts will refer to those larger ERP systems as the Tier 1 ERP systems. Those are the ones that are typically better suited for larger organizations, multinationals, more complex organizations, multi-location types of organizations. Those Tier 1 providers are generally trying to provide a breadth of functionality that can meet the needs of those organizations. There's also Tier 2 ERP providers, and these are the providers that are more niche-focused solutions. They might focus on one industry, might focus on one set of capabilities. Just to give you a few examples, Epicor and Infor, for example, are two manufacturing ERP systems that are very common in the manufacturing space, but you don't see them a lot in other industries. You don't see them, for example, in a lot of financial services organizations or professional services organizations. They tend to focus more on manufacturing and distribution and nothing else. So that is another example or another segment of the ERP space, is that whole Tier 2 market. And then you have your Tier 3 or industry niche solutions that there are probably dozens or hundreds of different ERP solutions that fall into that segment. They're either smaller, simpler solutions that can provide capabilities to specific industries, or perhaps certain functions or capabilities within ERP. They may not even be providing full ERP capability. They may be focusing on just one small segment within ERP. And like I said, there's a ton of different options and solutions in that space. So overall, if we look at all the different types of ERP systems out there, there are easily dozens, if not hundreds, of ERP systems that can be used for your organization. Typically, the going-in proposition with ERP implementations is that you're going to have one ERP system that can do everything that you would need technology to do for your organization. Now, that is an ideal situation. It's a perfect world scenario, but the reality is most organizations have unique needs and unique challenges that can't be met by one single ERP system that's trying to be everything to everyone. So what the single ERP system model has done is it's created a niche or a void that's being filled by what we call best-of-breed ERP systems. And these are systems that are not meant to be one single ERP system that's going to be everything for everyone within your organization, but it might be that you're focusing on different segments of your business. So for example, within your sales organization, you might have CRM or customer relationship management software. Within your HR department, you might use a separate or a different human capital management software that specializes in that. And Workday, for example, is a good example of a system that provides just HCM capabilities. You might have a different system that provides financial and accounting capabilities. And you could also, in addition to those examples, be using a core back office ERP system to tie it all together. So best of breed systems is a common trend that we're seeing in the market. And it's in some ways more complex because now you have multiple systems that you have to tie together. But in other ways, it provides more flexibility. It provides more precise fit with what your unique business needs might be. And there's certainly trade-offs to both the best-of-breed model as well as the single ERP model. But when talking about ERP, it's important to look at the whole picture. What are those spectrum and continuum of options available to you in the marketplace? You've probably seen that ERP implementations quite commonly fail. In fact, many statistics put the failure rate at above 80% of organizations that try to implement ERP, whether it's a tier 1 system, a tier 2 or 3 system, or a single ERP, best-of-breed ERP. Doesn't really matter. The failure rate is fairly high. So the question becomes, if the technology is great and there's so much demand for this technology, how could they possibly fail as often as they do? And if you check out my channel and some of the other videos on my channel, just search the word failure, and you'll find a bunch of videos I've created about how to avoid failure, why projects fail, what some of the common challenges are. But in a nutshell, the reason ERP implementations typically fail is not because of the technology, but it's because of the operational and the people side of things. The technology in general is very robust, it's very sophisticated, it's innovative, it can do a lot of different things. That's usually not the problem, although technology can create complications during implementation. But the more common challenges and problems with ERP implementations are that we haven't adequately addressed our business process improvements, we haven't adequately addressed our organizational change management or our people needs. So in other words, and to put it simply, people don't like to change. And because they don't like to change, new technology, no matter how great it is going to be difficult for your organization to adapt to. So in its simplest terms, people and processes are why ERP implementations fail. Like I said, I encourage you to watch some of the other videos on my YouTube channel that go into that topic in more detail. But in general, that's why implementations fail. So the question becomes, how do we implement ERP software? If most of them fail, what can we do differently to implement well? And to simplify and to summarize what I've also talked about in other videos on my YouTube channel, the first thing is to find the right software or technology that's the best fit for your organization. That's kind of the first step. That's the minimum ante that you need to be able to succeed, is to make sure that the software or technology you're implementing is a good fit with what your needs are, and make sure you get an independent assessment and view, an objective evaluation of the different options in the marketplace so you can find the best technology for your organization. A second critical success factor is to ensure that your organization is aligned on what it wants to be when it grows up. A lot of times organizations are trying to implement ERP software at a time of turmoil, at a time of misalignment, or at a time of strategic misalignment, where the organization isn't on the same page with the direction it's going, it doesn't have a clear vision, and then you try to overlay new technology on top of that, and that's a recipe for failure. So making sure you have clear alignment on your overall organization is very important. And again, I've included some videos below that will help you further dive into that topic. And then the implementation itself. When we focus on the implementation, it's important not to focus too much on the technology, but to shift some of the time, resources, and attention from technology over to the people and process side of things. If we do the people and process side of things very well, and we also have alignment, and we've also picked the right software or technology for our organization, we have the best chances to succeed. But the problem is most organizations fail in one or more of those three critical success factors. And like I said, I encourage you to download some of the content I've included links to below that'll dive more into what you need to do to be successful for your ERP implementation. ERP software had its origins many years ago with some very simple types of objectives it was trying to accomplish. It was just trying to track inventory and orders and activities better within an organization. Sounds simple enough. But over the years, it's evolved into more than that. It's not only trying to tie together an organization, provide one common single source of truth for what's happening in the organization, but it's also now trying to introduce more advanced technologies and capabilities into ERPs. So for example, there's new artificial intelligence that's helping organizations automate some of their business processes better. There's machine learning that looks for patterns and exceptions to things as simple as accounts payable processing of invoices. Machine learning, for example, can automate the accounts payable process and use artificial intelligence to flag the exceptions or the things that look like outliers or the things that look like could be potential problems in your accounts payable invoice processing. So that's just one minute example of how machine learning and artificial intelligence is being used to take ERP to a whole nother level. You also have blockchain, which is being used by many organizations in pharmaceutical and food companies, for example. They need to track every raw material and part in an entire production process, an entire distribution process, so that if there's ever a recall or a regulatory problem, blockchain can be used to trace problems back to the supplier, and that's a new technology that's being provided. And then finally, one other common trend we're seeing is Internet of Things. If you have an Apple Watch and your Apple Watch is tracking your daily activity, that's an example of Internet of Things. It's tracking that information, it's storing it in the cloud, and what you do with that information and how information like that could tie back to an enterprise is very important. For example, a lot of manufacturing organizations will have Internet of Things type devices out on the shop floor that will be tracking data on the shop floor that will then tie back to the ERP system so that you can see complete visibility into what is not only happening within the corporate headquarters, but also what's happening out on the shop floor. So those are just a few examples of some of the trends that are emerging in the ERP space. If managed correctly, implemented correctly, and leveraged correctly, organizations can go to the next level in their respective journeys. But it requires the right focus, the right discipline, and also just finding the right technology. Now that we have this basic understanding and this fundamental understanding of ERP systems in general, let's go a little deeper and talk about how ERP systems actually work. ERP systems are very complex integrated systems with a number of different modules. So what I want to do next is more of a whiteboard session to dive into what exactly ERP systems are, just to help you visualize and understand ERP systems in general. I'm going to talk about sort of the mechanics of how ERP systems work, along with some of the nomenclature that you should be aware of. And by the way, for more information about this, you can also check out my YouTube channel that goes into a lot more detail about what ERP systems are and some of the different terms and definitions you need to know. So be sure to check that out. And I also wanted to invite you to download a white paper from our website that's called Lessons from 1,000 ERP Implementations. And it's a guide to best practices and tips and lessons learned for ERP implementations, and it'll help you understand how ERP systems work and how implementations work as well. So what I want to do today, though, is talk about the mechanics of ERP systems and how they work more from a mechanical perspective, and that's what we'll talk about. Before we dive into what ERP systems are and how they work, it helps to understand what we're moving from. In other words, organizations are implementing ERP systems because they're trying to replace their old legacy systems. So that's the starting point we have here, is you have legacy systems that organizations are starting with, and these legacy systems might be anything from an old ERP system. It could be a system that was deployed 10 or 20 years ago, maybe even longer. Oftentimes organizations are still using mainframes, believe it or not. If you don't know what a mainframe is, it's something that was used mainly in the 60s and 70s. And it was they're the big servers, green screens, transaction codes, a lot of stuff I don't need to get into here, but it's a very old, outdated type of technology, but a lot of organizations are still using them. And the number one legacy system in the world, I don't have any data to back this, but it's based on just qualitative experience, but the number one legacy system in the world is Microsoft Excel. So spreadsheets, in other words. Organizations that are running their business on spreadsheets, they've got people with a lot of tribal knowledge, and they're trying to document that tribal knowledge on their local machines in Microsoft Excel. So this is where organizations are starting from, is their legacy systems. And that's the first thing to understand, is what is it we've got today, and then what is it we're going to move toward in the future, and that's what I'll get to next. Now let's shift gears and talk about what ERP systems really are. And the first thing I want to talk about are modules. When you think about an ERP system, which is what we're moving to here, we're moving from legacy over here to ERP systems, we're going to have a number of modules. And modules are essentially a functional area or a specific business process that can be handled by the ERP system. But it's not just one big massive system, it's a set of modules, almost like a puzzle. You're putting together pieces of a puzzle, and each module handles their own part of the business. So for example, a lot of ERP systems might have a finance module. So this would be more the reporting and the financial budgeting, things like that. You might have an accounting module, for example. That's a very common one. Another common one would be inventory management. So this is tracking all of the raw materials and goods and materials you might need to run your business. Organizations also oftentimes have supply chain management supply chain management modules, I should say. You might also have CRM, which is customer relationship management. That's what your sales team would use to track their pipeline and potential customers. You might have your human capital management, which is your HR systems. This is how you onboard people, you track their training, their benefits, payroll, all that good stuff. So these are just a few examples. I won't go into all of them. Every ERP system has its own unique mix of modules, but in general, they have dozens, if not more, modules that handle different parts of your business. And some of these modules, by the way, especially supply chain management, might actually have sub-modules within it. So, for example, supply chain management might have logistics as a separate module. You might have procurement, for example. You might have I already said logistics. You might have transportation management. So those are just a few examples of sub-modules, and that's true for all of these. Finance might have accounting might have AR and AP. Finance might have budgeting, reporting, etc. So you get the idea here. The modules are the ways that ERP systems are built to handle specific functions. And in the past, or in some cases, there are systems out there that only focus on one or more of these modules. But ERP systems, one of the benefits of ERP systems is that they can do all these things within one single system, but still broken out into individual modules. And the key to understanding how these modules all tie together is end-to-end business processes. So you're going to have end-to-end processes that start with the individual transactions within each of these modules, but ultimately you need to tie it all together and provide those end-to-end processes throughout the entire organization, which is part of the value that ERP systems provide. So these are the building blocks for an ERP system. How do we start to build it? How do we start to deploy it? Well, the first thing we do, or one of the first things we do, is we configure each of these modules. They're not just out of the box working a certain way. There's certain decisions you need to make to really configure and personalize the software to fit your needs. And you're going to do this module by module typically. You're going to start off at the foundational building block side of things, building out the requirements and the configuration that are needed to get the software to work the way you need it to fit the needs of the business. Now, some ERP vendors have a certain amount of best practices or pre-configured business processes. So for certain industries or certain functions, ERP vendors sometimes will have sort of predefined ways of configuring the software for certain instances or certain industries. So that's one way you can sort of speed up this configuration process, but it doesn't change the fact that you have to define what your business needs are, define what your business requirements are, and then configure the software and set it up the way you need to going forward. Now, if for some reason you find that the configuration for any one of these modules is not enough, it doesn't give you the option you need to run your business the way you want to, then your next option is going to be customization. Customization is a little bit different because we're not just checking boxes and clicking buttons to get the software configured a certain way. Customization entails going into the software and actually changing the source code. It's a risky proposition, creates a lot more cost and risk than you might want, but sometimes it's necessary if you can't get what you need out of the basic configuration. The other option is if you find that any one of these modules don't give you what you need within the core ERP system, you might go out there and find another third-party technology to bolt onto or integrate to your ERP system. So a good example would be supply chain management. Supply chain management oftentimes is such a complex area that some ERP systems can't do supply chain management well. You also see it fairly commonly with CRM as well. There's a lot of best-of-breed providers out there, like Salesforce is the biggest one, Salesforce CRM, which provides really robust, deep CRM capabilities, but it's a standalone system, so you lose the benefit of having a single set of modules that are all tied together. You can still do it, but it's just a different way of approaching any deficiencies that the ERP system might have within these modules. So as we are configuring the software using either some of the pre-configurations or configuration we do on our own, we now need to figure out how to integrate the system. The system isn't just integrated out of the box. It provides the tools to integrate, but each of these modules are still somewhat of a standalone system that need to be integrated. So we need to make sure that we're tying together data flows and process flows across these different modules. For example, if we buy some inventory, we need that data, the fact that we just bought some inventory, we need it to tie back to finance and accounting. and that data needs to flow back and forth. Same with supply chain management. We need to make sure that we're buying inventory and we understand the impacts on supply chain management. And of course, it all starts with your sales and your customers. So as customers are placing orders, that should affect and influence how we manage inventory management, and that data and those process flows need to tie together through integration between modules. Now, if you have a third-party standalone system that you're going to bolt on, let's just call it third-party system down here because I'm creative like that. So third-party system, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to tie that third-party system back to the core ERP system. This is a little bit easier to integrate generally the modules within an ERP system, but if we have to, we can pull in a third-party system that's unaffiliated with this ERP system and tie it in through integration tools. Now we have to be careful though, because every time we do this, we're diluting the value of a single ERP system, a single platform that we can use. Might be necessary, maybe you're selective about it, but you don't want to get overly excited about doing too much of this, because then you start to wonder, why do you even have a core ERP system if you're going to bolt on a bunch of different systems on top of that? So you can do it, but you just want to make sure you understand some of those trade-offs. Now, the next thing we do, once we've configured the modules, we've integrated the modules, now we've got to test the processes and the data flows between the different modules. So again, it doesn't just magically integrate, it doesn't just magically work. Now we need to make sure that all the decisions we made in this complex set of modules, we need to make sure that everything's flowing the way it should, data isn't getting corrupt or lost along the way, make sure the processes and the transactions are working the way they need to support our business. And all of that is done by tying this all together after we've done the integration through testing. And typically you'll do different types of testing, which I've talked about in different videos on my YouTube channel, so I encourage you to check that out. But I have a whole video that talks about the testing process and the different phases of it and how you do that. And you can check that out in the link here above. But generally what you want to do is make sure that you're testing across these modules to make sure the processes work, the data works, and ultimately that people are validating within your organization, the people within your organization are validating that the system works the way it was intended to be built. So once we've done a few iterations of that testing process, now we've got to make sure that we get all this data over here. We need to move it all over to the new ERP system. So over the years, we've accumulated and presumably hoarded a bunch of data. We've got our old ERP systems that have been tracking data for decades, or however long you've had the system. Maybe our mainframes have been around for even longer. You've been using Excel spreadsheets all over the place. You've got different employees that are tracking different sets of data. So we need to make sure that we figure out how we're going to consolidate all this data, capture it all, clean it, and then ultimately map this data to the new technology. And when I say map, that's a little bit different than migration. So first is to map the data. So data fields over here might have different names than data fields over here. For example, in our old ERP system, maybe a work order was actually called a service order, but in the new ERP system, it's called work order. So we need to make sure that we map those data fields to the right place from the old system to the new system. And that's just one example. There's tons of different examples of ways we need to map data from old system to new. And it's oftentimes a messy process because new technology, new capabilities make it harder to track or to trace and map the data the way it was back 10, 20, 30 years ago to the way it is today. So it's not a perfect process, but it is something we need to do. And not only do we need to map the data, but we also need to make sure that this data is accurate. Over years and years of using these old systems, people make mistakes or they forget to enter things into the system and this data becomes inaccurate. So we need to go back and clean up this data. And then once we've done that, then we can migrate all that data over here, and then we can complete the testing process with data in the new system, and then ultimately we can go live with that data. Now, organizations typically don't bring all of their data over. They tend to be forced into some trade-offs and prioritization decisions around what data they actually need to bring over versus what they can leave behind. So that data migration process is very important, and it's actually an area that's oftentimes overlooked or underestimated in a digital transformation or ERP implementation. So you want to make sure you spend lots of time on that. So I hope this has given you a fundamental understanding of how ERP systems work, what you can do to understand these different nuances of ERP deployments. And for more information, more guidance and best practices, I encourage you to download our Lessons from 1000 ERP Implementations ebook. Now that we have a general understanding of what ERP systems are and how they work, let's dive into some of the buzzwords, some of the terms and definitions that are important to understand as you're entering the world of ERP systems or as you're embarking on your ERP implementation. And these are a few of the most important terms that are critical for you to understand so that you can speak the same language with your peers internally within your organization, as well as with your outside consultants, or if you are a consultant, it'll help you speak the same language with your peers as well. So let's dive into some of the top terms and definitions you need to understand as part of your ERP implementation. The first and perhaps the most fundamental term to understand is the term ERP itself. What does the word ERP mean? Well, the acronym itself stands for Enterprise Resource Planning, which that in and of itself, it doesn't tell you what it means, but the term Enterprise Resource Planning is really a way to describe technology that ties together an entire business. And the reason the term ERP came to be is because in the past, companies would deploy multiple technologies to do different things throughout an organization. So ERP systems were invented to really create a single enterprise-wide technology that could do everything from cash and financial management to inventory management to customer service and order management, warehouse management, manufacturing. Basically anything that an organization needed could be handled by an ERP system. So enterprise resource planning is a term that defines and alludes to the fact that it's a system that ties together an enterprise-wide set of business processes. A very common term that builds on the enterprise resource planning term is order to cash. An order to cash is a term that refers to an end-to-end business process that ties together multiple workflows and functions throughout a business. It all starts with a customer order and ends with collecting cash from the customer. And everything in between are the steps that happen along the way. So if you think about an order to cash process, typically what happens is customer calls, you place the order, you capture the order in the system, and usually that order will trigger a whole set of downstream activities that will be managed in the ERP system. So things like managing inventory or making sure you order the right raw materials to satisfy that customer order, making sure that you generate an invoice to ensure that the customer pays. Once the customer pays, you track the money that comes in. So there's a whole host of things that happen from the time the order comes in until you actually collect cash from the customer. And by the way, this will also include things like warehouse management, the manufacturing process, the planning process for manufacturing, really everything that goes into making your product a service and delivering that product as service to your customer and ultimately collecting cash from your customer. Similar to order to cash, you also have another end-to-end business process called procure to pay. And procure to pay is a little bit different from order to cash in that it's more focused on procuring the materials you need to run your business and ultimately paying for those materials. So it's sort of the opposite of order to cash in that order to cash is focused on fulfilling a customer order, whereas procure to pay is more focused on what an organization itself needs to procure and pay for to run its business. So if you're an organization that manufactures widgets, you need to acquire raw materials, in which case you're going to procure and place orders for those raw materials. You'll receive the raw materials and ultimately you'll pay for those raw materials. Sounds simple enough, but there's a lot of steps in that process and a lot of nuances that organizations go through when they're going through their procure to pay process. And the reason that this is such an important process is because when we look at the end-to-end business processes within ERP, you have your order to cash and procure to pay, which are really your two major end-to-end business processes that relate to an ERP system. Now, even though ERP systems are meant to be single integrated systems, the reality is that the way ERP systems are built are in modules. So it's not just one big massive system, it's one big massive system that's comprised of a number of different individual modules that ultimately integrate, tie together, and provide that end-to-end visibility and that end-to-end processing that ERP systems provide. So every ERP system is a little bit different, has different modules, different names for the modules. But if you think about the functional pieces of a business, most functional pieces of a business are going to have a module that relates to that part of the business. For example, in finance and accounting, you have your accounting and your general ledger module. You might have your financial planning module. You have your accounts payable module, your accounts receivable module. So a lot of different pieces within finance and accounting might have different modules or sub-modules that provide very specific functionality for a specific part of your business. But even though it's providing specific functionality, it's providing that functionality in a way that can integrate with the other modules to provide a complete integrated end-to-end business process flow within that technology. Other examples of modules outside of finance and accounting might be inventory management, sales and distribution, customer order processing. You might have warehouse management, transportation management, MRP or production planning in the manufacturing environment. These are just a few examples of some of the different modules that ERP software providers provide to their customers. The beauty of modern ERP software is that they can provide a lot of flexible, different types of business processes. Even though they have a standard way of working, a standard way of functioning, within the nuances of how that software works, they can be configured and tailored to meet the needs of different business requirements. So business requirements are what the needs are of the organization, the needs that determine how we're going to configure and set up the ERP software to accommodate the needs of the organization. And I'm going to come back to this concept of configuration later in this video. That's another term we'll get to. But for the time being, it's important to understand what business requirements are. And typically what happens is each function or each department within an organization has its own set of business needs, business requirements that it will define as a way to select and implement the right ERP software in the right way that best aligns with and meets their needs. Now, some organizations might have hundreds or even thousands of business requirements that they define as part of their business requirements, but they're not all equal. There's going to be those that are very high priority, things that you must have within an ERP system, and then there's lower priority ones that are more nice to have. In a perfect world, you might have these business requirements that are met, and you're going to try and accomplish as many of those business requirements as you can within your ERP system. But in general, the whole business requirements phase of a project begins early in the process, typically even before you've selected an ERP software. And oftentimes you're defining those business processes in even more detail once you've selected the software and it's time to go implement the software. Now, when implementing ERP software, in order to accommodate the business requirements that have been defined by the organization implementing the software, it needs to go through a process called configuration. And configuration is really a way to really personalize or set up the software in the way you want it to work. And every ERP software has a number of configuration tools, some more flexible than others that give you more options than others. But every ERP system out there is going to have a certain amount of configuration you can do. And a way to think about configuration is it's a way to change the software and change the way it works and personalize it to fit your needs, but not in a way that compromises or changes the way the software was written. So in other words, you're not changing the code of the software necessarily. You're not doing development work. You're checking boxes and flipping switches within the software to ensure that it does the right things and goes through the right workflow to match your business processes and your business requirements. So configuration is a mandatory part of any sort of ERP software implementation, and it's a key term to understand as you go through your ERP software initiative. Now, I mentioned that configuration is a way to change the software and personalize the software without changing the way the code was built. But sometimes an organization has such unique needs or is so different from its competitors that it needs to change the ERP software in some way beyond the limitations of what configuration allows you to do. In these cases, most ERP software will give you the tools to actually customize the software. And it may sound like very similar terms, customization and configuration, but customization is different in that you're actually going in and you're changing the code. You're doing development work. It's a lot heavier lift from a technical perspective. And you're actually creating additional risk because now you're changing the way the software was built and you're sort of rewriting some of the code that's been proven and established and working for other organizations. Now, oftentimes it's a necessary evil. It's something that organizations have to do in order to get the software to work the way it needs to. But other times organizations customize when they don't need to. There might be better ways that they could get what they need simply by configuring, which is less risky and less timely and less expensive than customization. So you want to make sure that you customize only in must-needed situations. Those mandatory business requirements that simply can't be met through configuration, you might look to customization as a way to tailor the software to fit your needs. Now, I mentioned earlier in this video that ERP software is comprised of a number of modules and submodules. Those modules and submodules are integrated with each other so that you're still using the same system, the same user interface, the same set of data, and the data is flowing and the processes are flowing throughout those different modules. However, in order to get these modules to work and to talk to one another, you still have to do integration. You have to ensure that the hooks or the ties between these different modules are there and that the data is flowing and the processes are flowing the way that they should. In addition, most ERP software implementations require that you implement that core ERP software with some other third-party system that's unrelated to the ERP system. Even though utopia is to have one system that's used by everyone within the organization to do everything an organization needs, typically most ERP software is not going to give you 100% of what you need, and it requires that you have some other standalone systems to support that core ERP software. In these cases, you need to integrate with those third-party systems as well to ensure that the data flows back and forth between your core ERP system and all the modules within it and these third-party systems. A good example and a common example of third-party systems that require integration to the core ERP software is going to be in any sort of regulated industry. If you think about pharmaceuticals or the food industry, there's strict government compliance regulations that require that you have certain processes in place and that you track information a certain way. Oftentimes, those standards and needs aren't met by simply having an ERP system in place. Oftentimes, you need a standalone separate system to track whatever information or processes you need. But whatever the cause is or whatever the reason is for having these third-party systems, you want to make sure that you build that integration to ensure that the data is flowing between the core ERP system and those third-party systems. And typically this is done through what's called APIs. And I won't get into a bunch of technical details, but APIs are generally the tool or the technology that's used to create the hook or the integration points between the multiple systems. Enterprise architecture is another important term to understand as it relates to ERP software. And it ties back to the previous point I made about integration. So when we're talking about integration, we need to have a blueprint or a big picture vision of how different systems and different modules within the ERP system are going to talk to one another. So in other words, we need to define where the integration points are, how data is going to flow back and forth between those systems, and ultimately where the data is going to reside. Where's that ultimate single source of truth going to be in terms of where the data resides? And that's a big part of what you define as part of your enterprise architecture. So when you hear the term enterprise architecture or software or solution architecture, those terms are somewhat interchangeable and refer to basically a visualization and a map of how different technologies and different modules within technologies are going to talk to one another, where those data points are going to be, how the data is going to flow, how different transactions will flow and touch between multiple systems. And so that's ultimately what enterprise architecture and solution architecture means. In order for an ERP system to work properly, it needs to have data, and it needs to have historic data. So data you've brought over from previous systems that you had in place prior to deploying a new ERP software. And so data migration refers to the whole process of cleaning up your data that's in your old system, because oftentimes the data in the old system is corrupt or it's become dirty and inaccurate over the years, so you need to clean up that data. And then you need to figure out how those data fields and those data points map to the new system, because you might have different naming conventions for different fields and different subjects within the system, and then ultimately how you're going to move that data from the old system to the new one. So that whole process I just described is really falling under the bucket of data migration. And so data migration is the way that we clean and map and move the data from our old legacy systems to our newer ERP software. So these are 10 of the most important terms and definitions you need to know as part of your ERP software implementation. One of the tricky things about ERP implementations and ERP software in general is that there's a lot of different options. You have two basic types of ERP systems. You have fully integrated single ERP systems, which are meant to provide one single user interface, one single database, one single application that ties together your entire operations. The other bucket of ERP systems is more of the best-of-breed model, and this entails choosing multiple systems to handle different parts of your business. So for example, you might have a core ERP system to handle your financial and accounting needs, but then you might have another system that handles your HR needs. You might have another system that handles your CRM or customer relationship management. You might have an MES or a manufacturing execution system that automates your shop floor. So a lot of different systems that do different things in the market, And rather than trying to be everything to everyone, these focus modules are more targeted on specific niches, or in some cases, specific industries that are meant to do ERP better than the traditional ERP systems can. So while some may argue that best of breed is not really ERP, it really is. ERP systems can be one single integrated system, or it can be modular based or separate vendors for different functions within your business. And different organizations have different needs. So you're going to have an answer that might be different than your next door neighbor or another organization in your industry. So let's dive into some of the pros and cons of single integrated ERP versus best of breed ERP. So let's start with the single ERP software model. That's frankly where most organizations start and assume they want to be, at least the clients we work with. They want a single ERP model. So we'll start here and we'll talk through some of the pros and cons here. So with single ERP, one of the biggest advantages is that you have one system. And the fact that you have one system leads to another set of advantages, which is there's a lower learning curve because you don't have to teach people how to use multiple systems. You're training them on one system. It's easier to maintain and deploy because you're focused on one system versus multiple systems for multiple technologies. It also provides a single source of truth for data. So when you think about a single ERP system, you have one system that houses all of your data. You don't have to worry about the data flowing between systems and something happening to the data because it's going in between multiple systems. You have one single system that's handling all of it. And that leads to another benefit, which is that there's less technical complexity with one system because you don't have to tie together multiple systems. You don't have to worry about all the different integration points and some of the architecture issues that come up as a result of having multiple systems. So there's less technical maintenance here. And complexity, I should say. So these are just a few of the advantages and reasons why you might consider one single ERP system. Now let's talk about what a best of breed model might look like and how it compares to the single ERP system model. So far, the single ERP software model sounds pretty good. When I look at this, I think that sounds reasonable. It sounds like something I would want if I were a leader within an organization. But let's also look at the best of breed model to see if it is as good as it seems to have a single ERP software model. So let's talk about best of breed. And again, just as a reminder, best of breed means that we're not looking for one single system to do everything throughout our organization as we are here. What we're doing here is we're looking for the best technologies for the different parts of our organization. So for example, your accounting and finance group might go out and buy a finance and accounting system. Your supply chain managers might go out and find a supply chain management system. And your sales team might go out and find a separate customer relationship management or Salesforce automation system, and so on and so forth. So the idea here is rather than finding one technology across the enterprise, we're finding the best technologies for different parts of our organization. Now, some of the benefits of best of breed would be that you're more likely to find the better fit across the organization. Now, when you talk to a software vendor, especially the ERP vendors that sell the single ERP software model, they're probably going to tell you that this isn't true. Their software can do everything that best of breed can just as well, but you get all these advantages. The fact of the matter is that's not true. When you go out and look at best of breed models, you find that there are technologies out there that can typically handle certain functions better than any one system can. And the reason for that is because no single ERP software vendor is going to be able to be everything to everyone. Even if they focus on one industry and you're in that one industry they focus on, it's likely that you have different nuances in different parts of your business that have different needs that aren't going to be satisfied fully by the single ERP model. The other component of best of breed that can be helpful to understand is that there's a higher learning curve. So whereas with single ERP, we said there's a lower learning curve, here we're saying there's a higher learning curve because you're having to train people on how to use multiple systems. So there's a higher learning curve here. One of the potential downsides here is that you could have multiple sources of truth. So in other words, for example, if we have a CRM system that's tracking our sales pipeline, and we're capturing prospective client information in that CRM. Now we're housing customer and prospective customer data in the CRM system, but we've also got presumably another system for inventory management or for financials where we need that same data, the customer related information, but it's not in the other system. So now we need to create integration, and there's integration back and forth, and there's more potential for something to break down or become undermined as a result of some of the human interactions between systems. So that's a potential upside or advantage of single ERP. And another consideration for best of breed is that this has higher technical complexity. So because we have to take multiple systems and tie them together, figure out how we're going to integrate these systems, how the data is going to flow, and ultimately what the overall landscape is going to look like, and we have to maintain that longer term, multiple systems, that adds to your technical complexity. So on the surface, when I look at this, I think, okay, if I look at these 4 categories or these 4 criteria that I've outlined here, really the advantages here are largely to single ERP system models. I say the advantages here, here, and here. And then here, I would say likely to find a better fit might be favoring best of breed. So on the surface, I would look at that and say, well, clearly we probably want the single ERP model because there's only 1 advantage here, but there's 3 advantages here. But here's the problem, and here's the thing that it comes down to for most clients we work with, is that this right here becomes the most important thing. And the problem here is this difference between these 2 models is a lot bigger than just 1 item on a checklist. So in other words, a lot of times you're more likely to find some bigger showstoppers over here because it functionally can't handle what it is you need it to do. So it ends up pushing organizations to want to at least consider more a best of breed model. Now, one thing I'll suggest is that in some cases, the fact that people resist this model and want to look at this model, that could be a symptom of resistance to change. So in other words, we don't want to change the way we do business today, so we're going to push for more of a best of breed model. But a lot of times, maybe even a majority of the time for a lot of organizations, you find that no, they really do have needs that are better satisfied here. And these are strategic business needs, not resistance to change. This is actual stuff that we need to do our business well and to be more effective as a business. So this becomes the biggest challenge for most organizations that are trying to resolve the debate and where they fall on the spectrum. So how do we figure out which model is best? What do we do? And are there any other options than what we have here? That's what I'll talk about next. Now, as if this trade-off and this decision wasn't hard enough, there's actually a third option that a lot of organizations don't consider, and that is a hybrid model. So that's saying that rather than choosing one or the other, we're going to have a core single ERP system that does all the core vanilla type functions within our business, and then we're going to do best of breed for the complex or the unique aspects of our business or our industry. So for example, a lot of times if you look at an organization like a manufacturing organization, a complex engineered order manufacturing organization, let's say, you might have a core ERP system that handles all the financials, basic inventory management, basic bill of materials and customer information, things like that. But when it comes to product lifecycle management, CAD drawings and engineering types of processes, you might have bolt-ons that would bolt on to the core ERP system. And this ends up being a good middle ground for a lot of organizations that are really having trouble deciding between these two. And by the way, vendors even recognize that this is a very powerful model because a lot of vendors like SAP and Oracle, for example, and even Microsoft, they've gone out and acquired a lot of best-of-breed providers because they know that their single core ERP system can't do everything they needed to do or that their customers needed to do. So they go buy these best-of-breed providers so that they can say that they have a single ERP system when in reality what they're doing is they're providing a hybrid model to their clients. So regardless of which model we lean towards, whether it's single ERP, best-of-breed, or hybrid, one thing that's very important is integration and operability. So when we think about interoperability and integration, what we're talking about is how do multiple systems tie together. So especially if we're going down the hybrid path or the best-of-breed path, we need to have a clear vision for how systems can tie together and how we can leverage solution architecture and integration to ensure that we tie the systems together. But that function is important even in the single ERP model because, as I mentioned earlier, so many vendors have gone out and acquired best-of-breed providers as bolt-ons to their system that are technically third-party systems. It just happens to be that the vendor owns those multiple systems. So interoperability, integration is something that's very important in any sort of digital transformation, especially if you're going down the path of best-of-breed or a hybrid. So the question now becomes which of these models is best? And as you may have heard me say in a lot of videos, it depends. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish as an organization and what your priorities are. If this is your number one priority right here, and you know you need to find the best technical and functional fit for your business processes and your needs, and you know that your business is fairly unique in terms of being in a unique industry, or you have a distinct competitive advantage that others in your industry don't have, it's probably going to push you more toward the best of breed model. But if you're a younger organization, you don't have established business processes yet, perhaps you don't have any complex business processes or needs yet as an organization, a single ERP system probably makes more sense. And of course, you might be somewhere in between. If you're somewhere in between those two extremes on the spectrum, you might find that the hybrid model works best. What a lot of our client organizations do, especially when they come to us and say, hey, Third Stage Consulting, can you please help us define a digital strategy that helps us leverage the best single ERP system? We may start with that as a starting goal, but then recognize that we only get, let's just say, 80% of the way there. So, which is a reasonable number, by the way. If we say we have 80% fit here, that's great. That means we could probably start here and at the very least, maybe do a hybrid. We may not necessarily need to go fully down this path, but we may find that we need to now figure out what do we do with the other 20%. Are we going to water down our business processes and let the software dictate how we do the processes? That may be an answer depending on what the process and the function is and how important it is strategically to your business. Or it could be that no, we're going to actually go find via a hybrid model some other best of breed options that we can plug into or bolt onto our ERP system. So those are the kind of trade-offs and the decision points that you need to go through as an organization to determine what the best fit is for your organization. So for more information and best practices on how to navigate decisions like this, as well as specific software reviews and rankings that we do on an independent basis at Third Stage Consulting, because we're not affiliated with any software vendors and we don't sell software, we don't support just one software system, we support them all. For more information and best practices to help you with this decision, as well as other strategic decisions that you need to make as part of your digital transformation, I encourage you to read my Digital Transformation Report, an annual report we publish each year that highlights best practices and lessons learned from digital transformations throughout the world, as well as independent reviews and rankings of different technology options that you might consider, both in terms of single ERP systems as well as best of breed and hybrid models too. So I encourage you to download that digital transformation report to give you some starting point ideas on what your short list might be or what your long list might be for some of these different categories here. Now that we understand how ERP systems work and what some of the nomenclature in terms of definitions are, we understand the pros and cons of best of breed versus single integrated ERP systems. Now let's dive into specific software vendors. Let's talk about the top 10 vendors in the industry. And this is only 10 vendors we're going to give an overview of here. There's hundreds of software solutions that provide ERP systems in the market. So take it with a grain of salt, but these are the top 10 in terms of the ones that are most commonly selected by our clients and the ones that are most successful in their deployments. However, having said that, this is a general top 10 list that may or may not apply to you as an organization, and you may find that you have a totally different top 10 list based on your specific needs. But having said that, this is a good introduction to understand some of the major players in the marketplace. Before we jump into the top 10 list for this year, it helps to talk about the methodology we use this year compared to past years, as well as what changes happened at a high level to the top 10 list. First of all, we'll talk about the changes. So in other words, what systems are no longer in the top 10 that were in the top 10 last time we did this ranking? Well, there's two vendors in particular that fell out of the top 10 that were in the top 10 in the past. One is Sage X3 and the other is Acumatica. Not that there's anything wrong with these products, but the ERP software field is becoming very crowded and there's a lot of movement and advances in the industry. And there were just simply other vendors that moved further into the top 10 and knocked those two out. So that's the first thing to note, is these two vendors are no longer in our top 10. The other thing to note is our ranking methodology. How did we decide who is or isn't in the top 10? And how did we decide how the top 10 compared to one another? Well, what we do is we look at overall functionality of the software, we look at the cost and risk of deploying technology, and we look at the results that our own clients get from having chosen and implemented these different technologies. And the beauty of being completely technology agnostic and 100% unaffiliated with all of these software vendors is that we get a broad view of the marketplace and we understand the good, the bad, the ugly of all the different software vendors and the outcomes that we see with our clients. The one thing I'll say that is a bit different and has a heavier weighting this year than in years past is the failure rate of implementations. We looked very heavily this year at what is the failure rate of these different vendors, and that worked against some vendors in this case. You'll see a couple of vendors that fell in the top 10, largely because of their implementation results, not so much because of their technology or the functions and capabilities. So that's a bit about the methodology. So let's jump into the top 10 list now. Coming in at number 10 is the Force platform. And the Force platform is actually owned by Salesforce and is created by Salesforce. And it's essentially a platform that allows Salesforce to be more than just a CRM solution, which is what it's known for. Force allows organizations and third-party developers to extend Salesforce's capabilities or change Salesforce's capabilities by creating third-party applications and adding additional layers of features and functionality for specific functions and or industries that allow organizations to have a semi-tailored solution that's a broad ERP type of solution. Last year, Force was number 9 on our list. It dropped to number 10, but it's still a very strong solution, and it's a good alternate for organizations that don't necessarily want a single application, but they want to deploy a platform that gives them a lot of flexibility to tie together different systems and potentially even create their own custom applications to tie together with that Force platform. Now, if you're looking for more information and a deeper dive into Salesforce and the Force platform, check out this video right here. It's a review that I did not too long ago of Salesforce, and this video will dive into the features and functionality of Salesforce in more detail. Coming in at number 9 is Odoo. Odoo is an open source system that has gained a lot of traction and momentum in the marketplace. It was number 8 on our list last year. It fell slightly, just a little bit, to number 9, mainly because there were 2 new entrants that moved ahead of Odoo in the top 10, but still enough to keep it in the top 10. And the reason Odoo is in our top 10 is because it offers a good alternative to smaller and mid-sized organizations that are looking for a system that gives them flexibility and allows them simplicity in a sea of really complex ERP systems. Odoo is also very cost-effective, so a lot of smaller and mid-sized organizations that don't have big budgets are able to afford Odoo. But the downside risk of Odoo is that it may not be big enough or complex enough or robust enough for a larger organization. And another downside risk is that Odoo as an organization seems to be getting a little ahead of itself trying to go after larger organizations when their software isn't quite capable of some of the larger, more complex needs of organizations. But despite those negatives, there is enough strengths with Odoo to keep it in our top 10 at number 9 on the list. And if you're looking for a deeper dive review of Odoo and understanding the pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses, check out this video right here. It's an independent review that I did of Odoo that talks about what some of those strengths and weaknesses are in a bit more detail. Coming in at number 8 is Oracle NetSuite. Oracle NetSuite was number 2 last year, and it dropped a few places to number 8, largely because of some of the implementation challenges that we've seen amongst their customer base. Now, let me start with the strengths, though, of what the strengths of the product are and why it's in our top 10 list. First of all, it's a pioneer in the software as a service or the cloud space. So they have a very mature product that's been around for a long time, unlike many legacy on-premise vendors that are just now making the migration to the cloud. The other strength of NetSuite is that it's designed largely for small and mid-sized companies. So if we were just to look at our smaller clients, NetSuite would actually be much higher on our list. In fact, it might be as high as number 1 on our list if we were to look at our client base right now, just among small clients. But because we're looking at companies of all sizes and industries, NetSuite doesn't quite have the capabilities to support larger and even mid-sized organizations. And perhaps the biggest thing holding back NetSuite in our top 10 list this year is the implementation results that we're seeing with some of our clients. Some of our clients have struggled with the relative lack of flexibility of the product, combined with the complexity of the product as well. And this is largely because of the SaaS model. When you have a software as a service model that is essentially multi-tenant, that limits the flexibility of what you can do with it, unlike other cloud solutions. But all that being said, NetSuite is a very strong product. It's used by a lot of organizations, and if you're in the smaller mid-market, it might be especially appealing to you. Now, one other interesting data point as it relates to Oracle NetSuite is it is actually number 2 on our list of the most commonly selected systems by our client base. So that's something that's worth noting as well. Now, if you're looking for a deeper dive into the strengths and weaknesses and the pros and cons of Oracle NetSuite, check out this video right here, which is an independent review that I did recently of the pros and cons of the software. Coming in at number 7 this year is IFS. And IFS is a unique solution that focuses heavily on construction and field services and some manufacturing and distribution. And they're a software vendor, unlike many others, that are not trying to be everything to everyone. They know what they're good at, and they tend to stick to their knitting in that regard. Last year, IFS was number 5 on our list, and they are the 7th most selected system amongst the third stage global client base, which is why it's here in our top 10 again this year. Some of the strengths of the product include the focus that I talked about and the fact that they're growing fairly aggressively throughout the world, and they're really putting a lot of effort and time and resources into building out their ecosystem of partners that can sell and implement the solution. So those are some of the strengths. Some of the downside weaknesses are that because this is a general ranking of top 10 systems across all industries, IFS doesn't fit in all industries, and that's okay, but it's something that does hold back IFS from being higher in our top 10 list. Having said that, because they do focus so much on certain industries, they tend to have somewhat of a higher implementation success rate as a result of that. Now, if you're looking for more information about the pros and cons of IFS in more detail, check out this video right here. It's an independent review that I did of IFS that talks about the strengths and weaknesses of the product in a lot more detail. Coming in at number 6 is SAP S/4HANA. And S/4HANA dropped from number 4 in last year's ranking down to number 6. And it's also our number 4 most selected ERP system amongst our global client base. Now, S/4HANA is a very robust product. It can do a lot of different things. It's designed and built for the Fortune 500 and the biggest organizations in the world. That's the good news. The bad news is that there are some material deficiencies in the product as they continue the transition from on-prem, ECC, and R3 types of solutions to their cloud S/4HANA solution. Another reason that S/4HANA has dropped in our top 10 ranking is because the implementation results have not been as strong as other software vendors. There have been a lot of SAP implementation failures in recent years, and in fact, even in our own client base, we've had a couple clients that have completely canceled their S/4HANA implementations because of material concerns with the product and with the implementation itself. So for those reasons, although the system is falling in our top 10 ranking, it's still a very strong and very prevalent product in the marketplace, and that's why it's number 6. For more information and details and understanding of the pros and cons of the system, you can also check out this video, which is an independent review of S/4HANA that I did not too long ago. Coming in at number 5 is a new entrant into our top 10, and that is Epicor. And Epicor is a vendor that owns a number of different systems that I'm not going to go into in a lot of detail here, but they own Vantage and Profit 21 and a few other different ERP systems that focus on different industries. Some of the industries that Epicor focuses on includes manufacturing, distribution, and retail. Those are 3 of the industries that we see them most commonly used. In fact, Epicor is the 5th most commonly selected ERP software across our client base, which is part of the reason why it's new to the top 10. Another reason why Epicor is new to the top 10 is because in years past, they actually struggled as an organization. They had a lot of troubled implementations. They had stripped back on their professional services group. They had really cut back on their ecosystem of implementation partners. But in more recent years, they've really put in place a new leadership team that looks very promising, and it's sort of an all-star group of executives that have been in the industry for a long time. And the vendor itself and the products themselves seem to be headed in the right direction. So for those reasons, combined with the results we're seeing with our client base, that's why Epicor is number 5 on our list. Now, if you want to learn more about the strengths and weaknesses of Epicor Vantage, which is their flagship product, you can watch my independent review of the software, which you can find right here on my YouTube channel. Coming in at number 4 is Workday. And Workday has been on our list in the past, but it wasn't in our top 10 list last year. The reason it wasn't in our top 10 list is because some of the missing capabilities in core ERP functionality. Workday has historically been known as more of a financials and HCM or an HR sort of technology, but in recent years, Workday has invested heavily in supply chain management and really expanding the ERP-esque capabilities of the product. The other reason why Workday is new to our top 10 list and made the top 10 this year at such a high level is because more and more organizations are choosing Workday. They're gaining a lot of traction in their sales cycle and in the marketplace. And their implementations do have troubles, just like any software vendor, but they seem to be building a positive track record of implementation success. So you may have thought of Workday as just an HR or just a financial type of system, but it's important to think of Workday as more of a complete ERP system. If you're looking for more information about the pros and cons of Workday in more detail, check out this video right here, which is an independent review of the pros and cons of the solution that I recently published on my YouTube channel. Coming in at number 3 is Infor Cloud Suite, which is up from number 6 last year. It's also the number 3 most selected system amongst third stage's client base. And the reason Infor Cloud Suite has moved up is largely because it's being selected at a higher pace amongst our client base, but also because Cloud Suite is starting to finally get some traction and some stability to the Cloud Suite solution. For a long time, Infor has really struggled with M3 and Sightline and some of the other legacy products, and having a clear roadmap for Cloud Suite going forward, and having a unified roadmap for Cloud Suite going forward. But now we're starting to see the fruits of the last few years of their investments in Cloud Suite in advancing the product as well. Having said that, there are still imperfections with the product. There's still some confusion and sort of a mix and match of different solutions that are required to satisfy many clients' needs, but they've come a long way and their product is a lot more complete than some of the other products in the marketplace. So for those reasons, Infor is number 3 on our list this year, and you can learn more about Infor Cloud Suite in more detail in terms of features and functionality and pros and cons by watching this video right here from my YouTube channel that dives into my independent review of Infor Cloud Suite. Coming in at number 2 is Oracle Fusion Cloud ERP, which is up from number 3 last year, so it moved up 1 in our ranking. And it's also the 6th most selected software among ThirdStage's global client base. Now, the reason Oracle has moved up in the ranking and the reason it's so high in our ranking is because it provides a flexible option for large organizations. Oracle generally focuses on the big multinational organizations. It's a robust product. It can do a lot of different things. It has a lot of diversity in its functionality, but it's also flexible, more flexible than, say, an SAP S/4HANA, which is why it rates higher than SAP. Oracle also has less of a black eye when it comes to implementation results. Although there are plenty of implementation challenges and even some failures in the Oracle ecosystem, Oracle Fusion Cloud ERP has a lower failure rate than SAP in terms of the data we've seen. The other thing to note with Oracle Fusion Cloud ERP is that it has more of an open architecture that can more easily be integrated with other types of systems and solutions. Now, if you're looking for more information on the pros and cons of Oracle Fusion Cloud ERP, check out my review right here on my YouTube channel that provides the pros and cons from an independent and tech agnostic perspective. Coming in at number 1 this year, which is the same as last year's number 1, is Microsoft Dynamics 365 F&O, and the F&O stands for Finance and Operations. The reason it's number 1 again this year is largely because Microsoft D365 appeals to such a large customer base. They generally focus on mid-market and larger organizations. So while SAP and Oracle tend to focus on just the big companies, and NetSuite and Odoo and others tend to focus on the smaller companies, Microsoft D365 sort of straddles between both. They cover the mid-market as well as larger organizations. So it's a product that can scale, but it's also not too much overkill for a smaller mid-sized company that might want to deploy technology. The other reason why Microsoft is number 1 is because, first of all, it is the number 1 most selected software by our client base, but also because it is a very flexible solution, and it's also a solution that has a familiar user interface in that Microsoft look and feel. It's also an open architecture that can integrate well with third-party solutions. So these are just some of the reasons why it's number 1 on our list. Now, if I were to focus on the negatives, the things that might hold back Microsoft D365, I would say that the biggest negative is the value-added reseller ecosystem. They really have no control over their ecosystem. There's a wide variety of discrepancy in the qualities and the strengths and weaknesses of different VARs out there. So you really have to be careful in choosing the right implementation partner because there's, quite frankly, too many of them out there. But all that being said, that's enough to land Microsoft D365 at number 1 on our list. And if you're looking for a more detailed review of the pros and cons of the functionality of the software, I encourage you to watch my video right here that dives into my independent review of the software. So those are the top 10 systems in our top 10 list, but there's a lot of systems that didn't make the list that you can make a pretty strong argument should have made the list. And in some years past, they have made the list. Some honorable mentions worth noting would be UKG. UKG is Ultimate Kronos Group. It's the merger between Ultimate Software and Kronos, and they've provided really a best-of-class sort of HR and workforce management sort of solution. So if you're not looking for a complete ERP system, but you're really honing in on HR and workforce management, UKG might be a great option. Another honorable mention goes to Palantir. Palantir isn't an ERP system per se, which is why it did not make the top 10 list, but it's more of a platform, a workflow management solution that can help tie together multiple systems. And in fact, you can watch my independent review of the pros and cons of the system by watching this video right here. Another one is ServiceNow. ServiceNow is oftentimes viewed as a pseudo ERP system, even though it's not a full-blown ERP system, but it's oftentimes used for service-based organizations and customer service-driven organizations. And you can watch my review of that software in this video right here. And then finally, Snowflake. Snowflake is a sort of a business intelligence tool on steroids that takes business intelligence to another level. It could be a great alternative to traditional ERP systems, but because it's not a complete ERP system, we did not include it in this year's ranking, but it is an up-and-coming technology that you might want to consider. And then, of course, the other honorable mentions would go to Sage X3 and Acumatica, two very strong solutions that were in the top 10 last year, and they fell out of the top 10 mainly because we had two new entrants that moved to the top of the list, but there's still two strong solutions worth noting. So I hope you found this information useful. Now that we've given this overview of ERP systems and how they work, specific vendors in the market, now let's shift gears and talk about how to implement ERP systems. One of the first steps that's critical to a successful ERP implementation is your definition of business requirements. And business requirements generally are going to summarize your needs and what you want to get out of the system for your future state. And that's the key word here, is future state. It's not necessarily focused just on how you do things today, but how you want to do things in the future if you had better technologies. So it's really important to have these business requirements, not only to help you select the right system, but also to help make sure that as you implement whatever system you've chosen, you've conducted that requirements traceability to go back and make sure that you've actually achieved and accomplished those requirements that you expected to see out of the ERP system. So let's dive into, in this next module, business requirements and how it fits into an overall ERP implementation. First, it helps to understand what exactly business requirements are. And as the name suggests, it's a set of descriptions of what you need technology to do to support your business. So typically what happens is organizations decide that they need a new technology or set of technologies, or they want to deploy a set of technologies to improve their business. As part of their process, one of the first steps is to define what those business requirements or business needs are. You can also view them or consider them in terms of what the business wants are. In a perfect world, if we could improve our business with new technologies, what kind of requirements might we have in that scenario? So business requirements are really a combination of the things that are working today that you want to preserve, but also looking to the future of, in a perfect world with new technologies, what kind of business needs and requirements is it that we want to have? Now, these business requirements are useful through the entire life cycle of any sort of ERP implementation or digital transformation. Business requirements are a useful tool for helping evaluate and select the right technology, but they're also a useful tool in terms of helping implement the technology the way you need it implemented. And that latter part is really important because a lot of organizations focus on business requirements to help pick the technologies or to select the technologies, but then they lose sight of those business requirements and they don't do much with it during implementation. So what I'll talk about throughout this video is how business requirements can be defined and how they can be used effectively in your digital transformation or ERP implementation. So the way business requirements gathering typically works is you'll have a series of workshops with different stakeholders and functional areas within your organization. You'll ask them to describe their current processes, to walk through their current processes, to talk through the things that are working well and the things that aren't working well. What are the pain points and the opportunities for improvement? And then another layer is also looking to the future. In a perfect world, if we had better technology, what might that look like and what might those business needs or requirements be? So we're looking at business requirements across the spectrum of what works today all the way through what could work or be possible in the future. And typically what we're doing is we're describing in a fair amount of detail what we would like the technology to do. Within our functional area, what is it that we would like the technology to do to support our business going forward? Now, one word of warning here and one tip is to make sure that you're not simply rehashing what you already do today and focusing just on the current state. The current state is important. There's probably things that you're doing well that you want to preserve and build on, but you don't want to simply automate what you've always done. You want to look to the future to define what technology could help with and also look to the ways that technology could potentially improve some of the pain points and opportunities for improvement within your organization. Now, once we've defined these business requirements through these workshops, we might end up with hundreds of business requirements. If you're a larger, more complex organization, you might end up with thousands. So it really depends on the size and complexity and depth that you'd like to go into. One thing I would say is that the deeper you go into the requirements, the more likely it is that you might run into analysis paralysis, but at the same time, you don't want to be so high level that they're not helpful in helping you select and implement software effectively. So you want to find that right balance to help you manage the project and using those business requirements as a foundation for the entire digital transformation journey. Now, once we have our full set of requirements, not all business requirements are created equally. Some of them are extremely important and extremely critical. They're must-haves, they're showstoppers if we can't get these business requirements, or they're very strategic to the organization. There might be another set of business requirements that are low priorities. It's just more nice to have. In a perfect world, yes, we would like these things to be accomplished. And then there's some that are sort of moderate prioritizations that are a little bit more important than nice to haves, but they're not super critical or absolutely critical to the organization. So typically you want to prioritize your business requirements in terms of high, medium, and low, or critical, nice to have, somewhere in between, whatever categorization you want to call it. Typically having those 3 layers of business requirements is critical, and that prioritization will help make sure that you recognize and navigate the inevitable trade-offs that happen when you're selecting and deploying technology. In other words, you're not going to find and deploy technology that meets all of your business requirements, so that helps you ensure that you're at least meeting the most important ones and maybe most of the moderate ones and maybe a fair amount of the low priority requirements. So that prioritization is just as important as the actual definition of the business requirements as well. Now, once we have our business requirements defined and we've prioritized them, now we can use those business requirements to help us identify, evaluate, and select potential technologies to help us with our business. So now we can look at demos from software vendors, and we can do it not just in the context of a sales pitch from a sales rep, but instead we can do it in the context against the backdrop of what our business needs and requirements are. And the great thing about this is it allows you as a potential customer to really drive the demo and the sales process with the sales vendors rather than the other way around. It allows you to ensure that you're looking at and evaluating technology through the lens of your business requirements, not necessarily just the cool bells and whistles that the technology vendors can provide. Now, having said that, during the demo process, while you're evaluating potential technologies, you may find that you add to your list of business requirements because you see something you really like in the technology you're seeing, and that might inform or help you shape some of your business requirements. But in general, you should have 80 or 90% of your evaluation requirements already defined early on. Now, one word of warning and a potential pitfall that you want to avoid if you can is that a lot of times organizations, when they have hundreds or thousands of different business requirements, they get caught up in analysis paralysis. They get concerned that they can't find a technology that meets every single one of those business requirements well. And that's to be expected. You're not going to find technology that can meet every single one of your business requirements well, unless you go out there and buy a bunch of point solutions that can handle every single nook and cranny within your organization. But the key here is we're using these requirements to compare different options, and we want to pick the best option, not the perfect option, but the best one. And those business requirements through the prioritization and the weighting process that I described earlier will help you do that. Another area that business requirements help with during a digital transformation or ERP implementation is in the software and process design aspect of the transformation. In other words, those business requirements now not only help you select the right technology, but now those same business requirements should help you implement the technology and design the technology the way you need to. And this is a great project governance tool. It's a way to keep the project on track and to keep the project focused on the business requirements and the business needs that you know you want to accomplish with this digital transformation. Now, one thing to note here is sometimes organizations will do a high-level set of business requirements during the evaluation process, but when they get into the design and implementation phase of the project, they'll go deeper and they'll define those business requirements in more detail. Some organizations will do those detailed requirements up front during the evaluation, in which case those same requirements can then be used to design and implement the technology. But regardless of when you do that and when you get into that additional layer of detail, you want to make sure you have those detailed business requirements defined before you start designing business processes and new technologies. If you don't have those business requirements in place and clearly articulated and documented, what ends up happening is your software vendor and your implementation partner will more than likely sort of guess as to what they think you need, and they'll build the software the way they're comfortable with or with what they know, not necessarily in the context of what's best for your business. So business requirements are a great project governance tool, and they're also a great way to give organizations control and ownership of their own implementations so that they're not being hijacked by the software vendor and the implementation partner. And finally, it's important to note that business requirements are not just useful for helping design detailed workflows within technology, but just as importantly, maybe even more importantly, those business requirements should help you design your future state business processes and workflows. That may sound like the same thing, but they're not. You've got your high-level business processes and workflows, and then you've got your more detailed, granular transactional workflows within the technology. And so rather than just building the technology from the bottom up, the business requirements that you've defined should help you define the business processes from the strategic level at the macro level all the way on down to that transactional level of detail. So business requirements are a great tool for helping you design not just new technologies, but also new business processes as well. Now, finally, requirements traceability is something that is often overlooked by implementation teams. I mentioned earlier in this video that organizations oftentimes will define business requirements and evaluate and select technology with those business requirements, but they too often ignore those business requirements as the implementation goes on. And this is a big mistake, because if you lose sight of what it is you're trying to deploy and what it is you're trying to get out of your technology, chances are you're not going to realize the ROI that you expect from your investment, and your cost is more likely to spiral out of control because you don't have that governance mechanism in place via your prioritized business requirements that help guide you and provide that sort of North Star to your overall implementation. So as you go from design to test to training to go live preparation, you want to make sure all along the way you have those requirements in the back of your mind, and you're looking at traceability of those business requirements so that you can not guarantee necessarily that you're going to achieve 100% of your business requirements, but instead that you can make an educated and informed decision and understanding of what requirements you have achieved and which ones you haven't. And then when it comes time to go live and you have that go, no-go decision, you can go back to those business requirements and say, what percentage of our business requirements have we accomplished and tested and validated within the new technology, and which ones haven't we? And can we live with those risks and those trade-offs? What often ends up happening is the high priority requirements, you expect that you have a very high percentage of compliance with those high level requirements or high priority requirements. With the lower level requirements or the lower priority requirements, it might be that you're not as concerned with achieving or validating all of them. And then the mid or the moderate ones might be somewhere in between. So the business requirements are a great way to ensure that you have that traceability throughout the entire cycle, from evaluation and selection all the way through implementation and go live. Another important first step in an ERP implementation, in addition to defining business requirements, is also to create a business case. A business case is critical for a couple of reasons. One is because it helps you justify the project and ensure that the investment you're about to make in new ERP technologies can be justified. In other words, you want to make sure that the business value is there. You want to make sure you have a good understanding of what the real total cost of ownership is. You want to make sure you have a real understanding of the quantifiable business benefits you expect to get out of your ERP implementation. And ultimately, you want to understand what the ROI or the cost-benefit analysis is. Return on investment, by the way, is what ROI stands for. So a business case is important to not only justify the project, but just as important, it's also an important mechanism to provide project governance throughout a project. So as you refer back to your business case, you'll be able to make decisions around, should we increase the scope? Should we add cost to our implementation? Should we customize the software or not? There's a lot of key decisions that need to be made throughout a project that can only be answered objectively by going back to your business case to see how those decisions might impact your business case. And then finally, longer term, a business case is meant to manage and optimize business benefits so that after you've deployed the technologies, now you can go back and measure your actual business benefits and try to figure out why there's gaps. Because most organizations, if not all organizations, are going to fail to realize all their business benefits on day one of a new technology deployment. It takes some time to get used to the technology and to fully leverage that technology, and the business case can be a great way to go back and ensure that you get that business value that you expected to see. So with that all being said, those 3 reasons why business cases are so important, let's dive into how to create a business case. And this module is more of a whiteboard session, unpacking a business case in a bit more detail. Now, there are several different dimensions of a business case. The one that most organizations tend to hone in on and understand the best is the cost side of the equation. So that's where we're going to start. Is we're going to talk about first how to create the total cost of ownership as part of our business case. Now, when we're looking at total cost of ownership, there's several different dimensions I want to unpack here and just show you what these different line items should be within your business case. The first is the software cost. And this is probably the one that's the most obvious and the most predictable, because you get a proposal from software vendor or vendors, and they tell you how much the software is going to cost if you buy it. And for the most part, it's going to be the most predictable part of your overall transformation, at least as it relates to the cost side of the equation. Now, typically your software costs are going to be some cost per year. So I'm just going to leave it blank because it depends on how many licenses you're buying, which vendor you're buying from, how many licenses or subscriptions you're buying. All those things factor into what the overall cost is. So I'm not going to give you a placeholder number here because it's going to vary so greatly depending on who you are as an organization. But there's some number here that you're going to have that's typically going to be an annual cost, especially if you're going down the path of the cloud technology. It's going to be an annual recurring cost. So I'm just going to assume that there's an annual cost per year, and that's one of the line items we need to figure out. Now, if you're doing an on-premise implementation, which some organizations still do, it may not be an annual fee. It may just be a one-time upfront capital cost, but then there's going to be an ongoing maintenance fee that might be quite a bit lower than that. So if that's the case for you, you might actually have two line items here, one for the initial software cost and then one for the ongoing maintenance. But for most organizations and most software vendors, they're going down the path of cloud subscription models, which involves an annual recurring cost. Now, the next thing we look at as it relates to the cost side of the equation is the technology implementation. And this is where you are talking to your software vendor or your third-party implementer that's providing technology-specific consulting to help you implement the technology and do the configuration, the customization, the setup of the software. There's going to be a cost associated with that. And that's typically a one-time cost that might be spread out over 1, 2, 3 years or however long it takes you to deploy the technology. But there's some sort of cost associated with this. Now, this number is a lot less predictable than the software cost. When we look at software cost, as I mentioned before, that's fairly predictable because it is a finite number of licenses or subscriptions, a finite number of modules and functionality that you're getting, and you can predict it a lot easier than implementation costs. Implementation costs are trickier because it depends on how long it takes, depends on how much your internal resources get involved. It depends on how competent your technology consultant and provider is. So a lot of different considerations here, but you do have a cost associated with the tech implementation. What I will say is that in most cases, the proposal that you get from software vendors or technology providers are going to underestimate this cost. So typically what we do is we'll add some sort of buffer here or contingency to allow for the unknowns, the things that the software vendor may not be considering. We also really dig into the assumptions behind this cost to make sure that they're realistic. If, for example, we find that there's assumption that you have 40 full-time people committed to the project and that's how they came up with their cost estimate, but you know you can't commit 40 full-time people to the project, then you need to rework that and figure out what is the real cost if we only provide 20 full-time people or whatever the number may be. So you really want to rationalize and poke holes in this number so you can get a realistic number, because this is where a lot of organizations get into trouble. Now, a lot of organizations will stop here. They get their proposal from their software provider and say, this is our total cost of ownership. However, there's a lot more costs that are hidden that organizations don't fully understand or plan for, and that's where they get into trouble again, or they run into unrealistic expectations, is because they didn't plan for these other costs. So I'll walk through what some of these line items are. What is going to be your technical implementation costs that are outside the realm of what the software vendor does? So we'll just call this non-vendor costs. So these are still implementation costs, but they're costs associated with a line item that is not going to be addressed by your software vendor or your system integrator, your technology provider, whatever it is. Examples might be data migration, architecture, integration, things of that nature, where maybe your software vendor is doing some of that work, but there's additional work that needs to be done to, for example, integrate to your legacy system, or to clean up all your dirty data and map it to the new system and migrate it over and do all the testing behind that data. Oftentimes, those are examples of separate line items that are going to add to the cost of your total cost of ownership. So think of this as not just one line item, but it could be multiple line items of non-vendor related costs. There's a cost associated with that. You also have organizational change cost. If you're doing this right and you want to be successful in your project, you're going to have some organizational change management costs. You're going to have training and adoption, communication, organizational design, all the things that are required to make your project successful. Your software vendor may do some things that really scratch the surface of what needs to be done here, but most organizations we work with find that they need additional support and help here. And this oftentimes is coming from another third party. For example, Third Stage Consulting, my company, will provide organizational change services as a separate line item for organizations going through the project. Now, finally, another line item that's commonly included in a total cost of ownership is the overall program management. And this is a line item that most organizations forget about. And the reason this is so important is because the technology vendor and the implementation provider is typically going to provide a focus on one work stream, which is focused on configuring and deploying a certain technology. However, you've got all these other activities and other aspects of a project that include internal resources, external resources from the software vendor, external resources from other potential third-party vendors. So you need a program management line item to consider the fact that there's costs associated with the program management. And so that's another line item that's commonly overlooked. And then a final one I'll add here is the internal labor. So oftentimes organizations will find that they don't have people just sitting on the bench doing nothing that they deploy on an internal digital transformation, but instead they end up having to backfill those resources by hiring more people to potentially either support these line items here or to help the internal resources that are supporting the project to help them do their day-to-day jobs while they're supporting the project. So these are the major line items that most organizations need to think about when they're defining their total cost of ownership, which is obviously one of the important inputs to creating a business case. Now, when we go through this exercise of looking at total cost of ownership, we're going to end up with a number here, right? Some sort of number that says the total is going to be whatever this value is, and that oftentimes becomes the bottom line number that we focus on as far as the cost benefit of our business case. However, there's another piece that is missing that organizations typically don't think about or consider when they're going through their digital transformation. So I'm going to add another line item over here off on the side because it's so important, and that is operational disruption. And another way to think about this is risk. What are the risks and the costs associated with operational disruption and things that could potentially go wrong, and what is the cost associated with that? This is a really important number here because this number can oftentimes be exponentially more than the cost of the implementation itself. Let me give you an example. If you're an organization that has a risk of potentially not being able to ship product or getting canceled orders or not being able to close the books, not being able to run payroll, what does that cost you as an organization? And if you quantify those costs, what if we can't ship product for 30 days, for example? What is that net impact to your organization? When we quantify that number, oftentimes, again, we find that that number is a lot bigger than this number here, and that tells us there's a lot of risk associated with this project. And we need to quantify this number because it could end up being that this risk becomes reality and it ends up becoming a part of the cost of the overall project. Now, ideally, we don't want this number to be material. We want this number to be as small as possible. We don't want a big operational disruption, but we need to understand the correlation here between these two numbers because it may be that in order to mitigate this risk here, which is a much bigger cost and a much bigger risk, it may mean that we need to modify these numbers here and invest more in the overall project to make sure that we mitigate the risk over here. Let me give you a quick example. A lot of times organizations will look at organizational change management and they'll say, this is a nice to have. Let's get rid of that. We can cut our costs in our bottom line right here. Well, what we've done by doing that is we've actually increased the risk here, which means this number is going to grow exponentially more because you've cut back on the employee human side of change and the overall change management side of the equation. And now you've increased the operational risk. So it may be that we decide, you know what, that's a terrible idea. So we're not going to do that. We're going to go ahead and invest more in change management, knowing that we've actually decreased the risk here. So we do need to think about this from the perspective of not just what looks good on paper and the line-by-line cost associated with the implementation itself, but what is the cost of the outcome if we don't do it right? So now that we've looked at the total cost of ownership and the cost of operational disruption, now we start to think about what is the cost benefit of the value that we expect to get out of our technology deployment. So this is where we focus on business value. Business benefits. This is the fun stuff. This is why we're going through this project. This is the stuff we expect to get out of the project when we make the investments we make over here. So some examples of ways we're going to get business value. I'm going to try and avoid the really, really high level stuff like reduce costs because that's too vague. I'm going to try and get a little bit more granular than that here. So I'll give you some examples of ways that organizations typically see business value. One is to reduce inventory. So if we can be better at planning and have a better handle on what inventory we have and better anticipate when we need inventory to be in stock at the right time, we can actually decrease our inventory levels, which frees up cash. And there's a dollar amount associated with that, not only in terms of the investment in inventory itself, but the carrying cost associated with that inventory and the handling costs associated with that inventory. So we need to quantify everything related to inventory reduction and quantify what that impact might be. It could also be that we are going to reduce SG&A costs. And these are, another way to look at this is going to be overhead costs. You think about all the manual rework, the manual processes we have within our organization, the extra people, the extra headcount we might have in our organization that contributes to managing all these manual processes. Some of those costs can go away over time. So we'll quantify what those SG&A costs are. Now, for some organizations, most organizations I'd say that we work with are doing a digital transformation not to reduce headcount necessarily, but to not have to hire as many people in the future as the company continues to grow. So there is a cost savings associated with that where you can start to quantify how much am I going to save if we double in size, but I don't necessarily need to double my headcount because now I'm more efficient. What is the increased value by decreasing the SG&A cost? And by the way, SG&A stands for sales, general, and administration costs. So it's basically all of your overhead and your sales cost. Another common business benefit you see with digital transformation is increasing revenue. So by having a better handle on inventory, by being able to automate some of our sales processes, provide better information to our sales team, we are likely to increase revenue too. So we want to understand what is that potential impact on revenue. Now, there's another business benefit that's a little bit harder to quantify, but it's really important to think about it from this perspective. And that is, what is the benefit and the value of having better information? So in other words, if we have better access to information, we can make better decisions, we can predict the future better, we've got a better sense of historic data. What does that mean to our organization? How can we quantify that in a way that demonstrates or points to increased business value and business benefits? This one's a little tougher. It's really dependent on your organization. Some of it might be captured up here in your ability to reduce inventory and SG&A costs and increase revenue, but there might be additional business benefits you want to look at in terms of how we're going to increase the visibility of information to make better decisions for our organization. And based on that, you can start to look at how that affects your overall organization. So these are just a few examples of ways that we can quantify potential business value. But the key here is to really look at this not at a super high level, even though this is fairly high level still. We haven't really gotten into, for example, if we want to decrease inventory, where and how are we going to decrease inventory? Which warehouse location are we talking about, or distribution center? Do we think we have abilities to decrease inventory levels? So we want to be very specific about these different benefits. Even though I've summarized them here at a high level, we want to break these up into more granular levels of detail so that we can ultimately measure and hold people accountable for the business value that we actually achieve, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So oftentimes when we create a business case, we use this information here to look at what are the overall costs, what are the benefits, and then we come up with an ROI calculation. We come up with a formula that basically says if we invest, say, $1 million here, we might get $500,000 per year for the next 10 years of business value based on these metrics here, in which case you would look at that and say, okay, over 10 years, we're getting $5 million of net benefits for the $1 million investment. That's a pretty good ROI. So there is a justification component to this, and that's where most organizations sort of stop with their business case. They say either this math makes sense or it doesn't. If it does make sense, then typically what happens is they'll move forward with their digital transformation. They'll make these investments over here, assuming they're going to get the value here, and then they sort of set aside the business case and move into execution mode to go implement new technology. What I'll say is that that's only getting you about half the value you should be getting out of your business case, because ultimately your business case should be a way to track value throughout the implementation and certainly post-implementation too. You want to be using that as a way to realize the value that you said you would get out of the project over here. So let's start with project governance first. And when we look at project governance, there's going to be inevitably decisions that come up during a project to change these costs. For example, a common one is when we look at the technical implementation. We had an estimate here of some amount based on some assumptions. Those assumptions might change during the implementation, and we might find that there is a need or a want to potentially customize the software, which is going to add to our line item here. Now, a lot of organizations will make an arbitrary decision of yes or no, we aren't going to customize based on whatever criteria they have. What they don't often do is look at, well, what does this mean to our business case? If increasing the cost right here could potentially help us achieve one or more of these measures over here of business value, then maybe it does make sense. If we invest $100,000 here to get $1 million of benefits over here, okay, maybe it makes sense. But if we're going to invest $100,000 of cost over here, additional cost, but we can't justify any additional business value, that's going to be a good project governance control for us to say, then that doesn't make sense. Let's not do that. So the business cases should be a living document that helps you make decisions around project governance as the project is going through the implementation. Once you've gotten through the implementation, you're actually using new technology. You're using these new processes you've put in place. Now you can go back and actually measure what kind of business value are we actually getting. And spoiler alert, most organizations don't get the business value they expect right away. And that's okay. If we go back and measure it, we can start to fine tune and figure out why are we not getting it. Maybe there's something wrong we did over here. Maybe we didn't implement the way we should have. Maybe we're not optimizing the business value here. Maybe we didn't invest enough in process improvement or organizational change. Those are all things we need to think about in a way that we can use the business case to optimize business value longer term, not just to justify the project up front. Now that we've created business requirements, we understand what a business case is. Now it helps to understand, how do we phase a project? How do we phase different steps in our process and different steps in our implementation? So the good thing with an ERP system is that it's a fully integrated system, or it's at least a set of technologies that can automate your entire business operations, your end-to-end business processes. However, for most organizations, you don't want to deploy all that new technology all at once. You want to incrementally phase it so that you're minimizing risk and you're giving yourselves time to gain momentum and make sure you're not spreading yourselves too thin. So phasing the project is really important. How you phase your project is going to be dependent on who you are as an organization, what your priorities are, what your scope is, your risk tolerance, your budget, your resource allocation. All that stuff factors into how you're going to phase an ERP implementation. So in this module, I want to dive into some of the considerations and things to think about to help you determine the best way to phase your ERP implementation. Essentially, when you're deploying new technology or technologies, you have two different schools of thought on how you deploy that technology. One would be that you deploy everything all at once and you flip the switch, and on day one, you're using new technologies across the enterprise, across all the different technology platforms that you've just implemented. The other school of thought would be that you take a more incremental approach and phase the project or phase the technologies to where you're not flipping the switch all on day one, but instead you might have certain parts of your business or certain modules of the technology that go live at different times in more of a sequential phased approach. And a lot of organizations might do somewhat of a hybrid, somewhere in between. What we're finding, though, over time is that most organizations are too risk adverse and they don't see a lot of value in doing the big bang, massive transition all at once. So most organizations inevitably end up with a sort of phasing strategy where they say, we're going to incrementally roll out this technology to different parts of our organization, or using different modules or different technologies throughout the overall transformation. But then the question becomes, well, how do we phase it? What's the right way for us to phase the project? How many phases should we have? How do we phase it? Do we phase it based on processes, based on modules, based on technologies? Does data consider or factor into it? These are all things that we have to answer questions to, and that's what I want to talk about here today. Is now that we understand what implementation phasing is and why it's so important as a risk mitigation measure, now we need to figure out, well, what is it we need to do to determine what the right phasing strategy is for our organization? One of the first ways that you can consider phasing your technology is by looking at business processes and choosing the business processes that are going to add the most value to your organization and focusing on those business processes first in your phasing strategy. So if, for example, top-line revenue growth is one of the biggest opportunities for improvement within your organization, it may be that your digital transformation focuses on automating your sales processes first to help drive that top-line revenue growth. You may set aside other technologies like financials or inventory management, other things that are still going to add value to your overall transformation and your overall business, but maybe not as much value as you expect to get from, in this example, your sales automation. So that would be one example you could look at, is look at your business processes and identify those areas that are the lowest hanging fruit, the most immediate value potential in terms of implementing new technologies, and focus on that phasing strategy first. Now, of course, we've got to reconcile what we think our priorities are in terms of business processes. We've got to reconcile that with the realities of the technologies and some of the other considerations we're going to get to here in this video. But that's one dimension to look at, one variable to consider first, is what business processes, which business processes are going to deliver the most value most immediately, and let's phase our project accordingly based on that. Another variable or dimension to view your phasing strategy from is the software itself and how the software is broken into different modules. So depending on what software solution or solutions you're deploying, you're going to have different ways that the software is architected and different ways of piecing together different modules of that particular technology. So that's one consideration you have to look at, is just what is the technology you're deploying and how would you potentially phase the strategy based on that technology. Another way to think about this is we have to deploy technology in a way that makes sense in the way the technology fits together for that particular vendor, that specific solution. So for example, it might not be realistic to deploy your financial reporting without also deploying your inventory management, as an example, because it's hard to do your financials if you don't have automation and good tracking of your inventory management. So that'd be a good example of how you may not want to split apart those two modules or those two functions into different phases. You might want to actually combine those into one phase. However, going back to my example earlier about sales automation, typically for a lot of software solutions, you can set aside sales automation without necessarily having to have inventory management or your financials put in place. So if you're implementing a new ERP system, for example, it may be that you deploy these technologies based on how the modules fit together. Now, no matter how you phase the technologies, there's going to be some sort of trade-off and interim solution or a Band-Aid that you're going to need to tie together some of these different systems. So if you, for example, just put in a new sales automation module, it might be that you have to create an interim integration from that sales automation to your financials so you can track revenue, for example. And that interim integration will go away eventually if you deploy other modules of that same solution to eventually automate your financials. But in the meantime, you've got to create this interim automation or this interim integration. So that's the sort of consideration you have to look at is, yes, now we've broken up our implementation phasing into smaller incremental pieces, but now we've created rework that has to be done to ensure that you have integration in the meantime while you're still rolling out the other types of technologies. So these are all trade-offs, pros and cons and risks that we have to manage and work through. But the technology limitations and the way the technology is architected is one consideration and one input into the overall phasing strategy. Another thing we need to look at is the organization itself. So when we look inward at us as an organization and where the most pain is organizationally or where the most opportunity for improvement is within the organization, we might find that that influences or affects the way we phase the implementation of new technologies. For example, if we find that the finance department is really under pressure, it's highly inefficient, a lot of manual processes, the data is siloed, people within the finance organization have trouble accessing data, closing the books every month, that sort of thing. It may be that that organizational pressure forces you to prioritize financials in this example. So you also want to look inward at who you are as an organization, your culture, where your pain points are, what parts of your organization you think might be most willing to accept new technologies, might be the most excited about new technologies, and use that as a way to prioritize and phase the project. It's a lot easier to have an early stage or an early phase of a project that's focused on parts of the organization that are excited and in the most need for new technologies, because that'll help you build momentum. And then when you get to other parts of the organization that might not be as excited or might even be adverse to new technologies, you've already built up some momentum and some quick wins along the way. So the organizational considerations are something you need to look at as well as another input into determining what the right phasing strategy is for your organization. Another consideration to look at as you define your phasing strategy for your implementation is risk management. So we as organizations and we as leaders within organizations have to look at how comfortable are we with risk and how much risk are we willing to take. And also we have to look at how are we going to mitigate whatever risk we do or don't accept. So this influences our phasing strategy because if we're more risk adverse, for example, it may be that that's going to cause us to want to be more incremental and maybe a little slower in our rollout. It might mean that we break our project into more phases. It might mean that each phase is going to be a little bit longer than a more risk tolerant organization. So we have to look at the realities of who we are, not necessarily who we want to be in the future, but who are we right now and what's going to be realistic for us as an organization, and then we manage the risk accordingly. We've worked with some clients that are extremely comfortable with risk. They're high growth, fast-moving organizations. They take on a lot of risk day to day, and they might be more inclined to take more of a big bang or something that's less phasing and more aggressive in the rollout schedule. However, most organizations we work with, especially larger, more mature organizations, are just more risk adverse, for better or for worse. That's not a judgment. It's not meant to be a criticism of those organizations. That's the reality of most big organizations, is they're risk adverse, and therefore they need to come up with an implementation phasing strategy that reflects who they are, and it has to be something that fits them that they can be comfortable with. But no matter what you do, if you phase the project, there are risks associated with more incremental approaches. The changes can take longer. The implementation itself can take longer. You have a lot of interim rework that needs to happen as you integrate legacy systems that are slowly being phased out. So there is risk associated with it. One of the biggest risks too is that change fatigue becomes an issue. As the project takes longer, if you break it up into too many phases, you end up in a situation where the organization itself starts to doubt the project and starts to get tired. So you have to look at all these risks on both sides of the equation and really assess your phasing strategies and your phasing options from the perspective of what's going to help us mitigate the risk the best and what's going to fit our risk tolerance the best as an organization. Finally, another consideration is managing the scope of the project itself. it might be that it's more appropriate for us to scale back the scope and roll out less technologies in the name of being more risk tolerant and managing risk more effectively, or making sure that we get the most value as we possibly can out of the technologies we do deploy, rather than trying to boil the ocean. Too often organizations try to bite off more than they can chew. They deploy too much technology that never gets used and never adds value to the organization. So there's something to be said for organizations that say, we're actually going to cut back scope and we're going to try and do it really well and knock it out of the park with what we do deploy. So reducing scope, managing scope, that's another consideration you need to look at, because that ultimately influences how you're going to phase the project. And one of the potential benefits of reducing scope is that you're also reducing risk. Now, you might also be reducing business value longer term, but in the short term, you might be reducing risk and reducing costs. And for a lot of organizations, that's more important. So again, you really have to look at who you are as an organization and what's most important to reflect your priorities and your overall strategic objectives. So once we've looked at our implementation phasing options and our alternatives, the pros and cons of each, we've looked at it through these different lenses that we've talked about. Now we've got to reconcile, because a lot of times you find that when you look at phasing through the different lenses that I've talked about in this video, there's some conflicts. There's some things that don't match up. In other words, it may be that what our business process priorities are don't necessarily align with how the software can realistically be deployed, in which case we've got to figure out how are we going to reconcile that and how are we going to sort of create a tiebreaker to figure out what the right answer is. So we take these qualitative inputs based on these different dimensions and variables that we evaluate the implementation phasing options from, and then we ultimately come up with a phasing strategy that makes the most sense for us as an organization. Now, the key here is to really look at the risks and the benefits of every option we consider. And we have to recognize that there's not going to be a silver bullet. There's not a perfect answer here. There's going to be trade-offs. There's going to be risks that remain no matter what strategy we develop. So we just have to understand what they are and have a risk mitigation strategy to address those risks as we define the phasing strategy. So these are some of the ways that you can look at and evaluate your implementation phasing options. Hopefully it's given you some ideas on how to start to think about your phasing strategy. And certainly if you'd like to learn more and discuss some ideas on how to phase your project, I'd be happy to brainstorm ideas with you. I've included my contact information below if you'd like to reach out for an informal conversation to discuss how you might phase your upcoming project. Now, as we continue to unpack the concept of how to implement ERP systems and we talk about how to plan for an ERP implementation, it's important to understand the difference between program management and project management. A lot of time organizations are focused on the technical project management of ERP systems per se, but they're not necessarily focused on the broader scope of what needs to happen to lead to a true digital or business transformation. In other words, we're not just deploying technology, we're deploying process changes, organizational changes, we're deploying new data models, we're deploying new architectures, new integration points. A lot of different things are happening outside the realm of deploying new software. So instead of just looking at software project management, we have to look at the context of the broader program management for the entire ERP implementation or digital transformation. And so in this whiteboard module that I'm going to dive into next, this is where I unpack and explain what a program is and how you could think about your ERP project a little bit differently in terms of a program rather than a project. So to start, I want to talk about project management. And that's the thing that I think most of us can get grounded in and really understand when it comes to digital transformation. So I'm not just going to call this project management, though. To clarify and be more specific, I'm going to call this software project management. And I'll discuss here in a moment why that is such an important differentiator. So software project management is essentially what most of us think about and most of us focus on when we hire a system integrator, for example, or a software vendor that's going to manage the software implementation. So this is where we get into things like the technical configuration. This is where we get into the overall design. Even before you get to the config, you have the design of the software. You'll have the technical testing of the software. And then ultimately, you're going to have the go live of the software. This is obviously not an all-inclusive project plan, but I want to call out these tasks that are commonly included within a software vendor or system integrator's proposal as the project management. Now, I don't want to be dismissive of the concept of software project management, but the reason I call this out and separated it is because it's one piece of an overall program. I'll talk in a few minutes about what those other components are, but it's really important to understand that when you hire a system integrator and a software vendor, they're really the project lead for a technical work stream. So project management is important here, but the project management is typically focused on deploying technology. And as we'll talk about, there's a lot of other pieces of a transformation that are just as, if not more important than this. And if all we do is focus on this, then what we're doing is we're underestimating the amount of effort, the amount of resources, the amount of tasks and deliverables that need to happen within a transformation. And we're neglecting all the things over here that I haven't gotten to yet that are even more important to ensure that we're successful. So to start, we want to understand what the technical project management is, but next we're going to talk about what some of the other components and work streams are within program management. So as we slowly start to unpack what program management is, I'm going to start by just saying we're going to have an overarching PMO. Typically, you want to have an overall enterprise program that's going to manage the entire program. So now what I want to do is talk about how this all ties together. Now, certainly within your overall PMO, and even if you don't have an internal PMO, by the way, this is something that you want to make sure you establish, is make sure you establish a program management office that can manage the overall program, including your software vendor and system integrator resources here. So the software vendor, software project management reports up to the PMO typically. And then that begs the question of, well, what else is there? Why do we have a whole PMO just to manage this? Well, the reason is because there's a lot more than just this. First of all, I'll say that software project management may be multiple work streams. So you may end up finding that you're not just deploying one technology, you're deploying a best of breed model, or you're deploying a core back office ERP system, but then you've got some third-party bolt-ons on top of that. So if you are deploying multiple technologies, you want to make sure that you recognize and identify that there's different threads, different software threads that have their own plans that ultimately need to be integrated up to the overall program. So that's the first thing, is you may have multiple technical and software work streams depending on what it is you're deploying. Now, secondly, even if you're just deploying one system, but especially if you're deploying multiple systems, you're going to have a segment for, call it the technical aspects that are not software specific. And specifically what I mean by this is overall system architecture, data, and integration. So it's really that overarching thread that ties together multiple technologies, and even within one technology, it ties together the different modules within this technology and any third-party bolt-ons you might have on top of that. That's really the architecture piece. So architecture, we're talking about solution architecture. How do these systems tie together? Not only the new systems that you're deploying, but in the interim, while you're deploying new technologies, chances are fairly high that you're going to want or need some sort of interim integration points to your third-party systems or your legacy systems that you have now. A lot of those systems, if not all of those systems, may go away eventually, but as you're going through the transformation, most organizations need to have that interim integration built. And so you need to have an overall solution architecture that defines how this is all going to tie together. The different technologies, the different modules within the same technologies, how does it all tie together? You also have your data and analytics, we'll call it. So this is where we get into data migration, data mapping, data cleansing, which is really just taking your old legacy data, making sure you clean it up, map it to the new system or systems, and then ultimately define what kind of analytics you want to get out of those new system or systems. So again, it does touch this part over here with project management, but typically this is out of scope with a software project manager and a software focused work stream. And then the other piece within this is the overall integration. And this is becoming an increasingly important function and an underrated function within digital transformation on the technical side, because even with the same software vendors, a lot of these software vendors have third-party systems that they've acquired that still have to be integrated with the core ERP or the core enterprise technology. So integration is very important, especially if you're deploying a best-of-breed model or you're using business intelligence and data analytics tools on top of a core enterprise technology. So this is another work stream, and this is a summary of some of the activities within the work stream that's not software specific, but it's very technical in nature and needs to integrate with the overall PMO and overall program plan to augment what's being done here on the software project management side of things. So the next project within an overall program that needs to be managed within a successful digital transformation is organizational change management. And this is anything to do with the people side of change. And this also goes well beyond training and communications. Now, typically when you hire a software vendor and system integrator, they'll tell you that we are going to help you manage the change. We're going to do change management. We're going to do that in the form of technical training. In fact, that's a concept I didn't mention before. but here's where you would say, or where a vendor would say, we're going to do technical training to teach people how to use our system to perform transactions. That's an important part of change management, but it's one microcosm, one subset of an overarching change management plan. An overarching change management plan should look at things like change readiness. What kind of organization is it that you are today? What kind of culture do you have today? What are you trying to become? And what does that mean in terms of the potential organizational pitfalls that might come along with that and the potential sources of resistance that might come along with that? Another important work stream within change management is change impact. So this is where you look at where we are today in our current state, where we're going in our future state, and how different work groups and departments and individuals within an organization are affected by that. Because ultimately, we can't do this tech training on its own without having done this change impact. We need this change impact to be successful in our training so that we can get the changes out on the table and help educate people on what the changes will be well before we get to the tech training. So that by the time we get to technology training, now we're starting to reinforce what we've already communicated and worked through with our employee base. Now it's more a matter of just showing us how to do it within the new system. Too often, software vendors and system integrators jump straight to this, and it creates a ton of resistance and a ton of backlash within the organization because the organization isn't ready for all the massive changes that come with new technologies today. That statement, by the way, is more true the older your technology is and the more of a leap you're making in terms of upgrading your technologies. And then a final work stream I'll focus on today, although this is not every single work stream within change management that I'm talking about, but some of the highlights. Another one is the organizational design. So as we're defining the change impacts, we're typically doing that in conjunction with business process improvements. And as we're defining what the improvements are, we're identifying how people's jobs are impacted, and we're also defining how the new organization is going to look. What are the roles and responsibilities? I'm actually going to call that out as a separate or a call out here. Roles and responsibilities in this new organizational future state. And again, we need to understand this as an organization. Our people need to understand this so that A, they aren't alarmed by some of the changes that are coming as part of the transformation, but B, so we can get more business value out of the transformation and this massive investment we're about to make in new technology. So organizational design, roles and responsibilities is another important thread within change management. Now, for more information on what a complete change management program looks like, I've included a link to a video right here that you can click on that dives into more specifically what change management is. I have a number of other videos beyond that one video that talks about what some of the methodologies are, some of the tool sets, the deliverables you should focus on. I'm not going to dive into all that here today, but check out those videos on my YouTube channel for more information about what makes an effective change management program. And for even more information, I encourage you to download our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a report that I wrote, or a white paper that I wrote, that unpacks change management as a whole and talks about all the different work streams and threads within change management, and it gives you a roadmap for how to deploy a change management program. So I encourage you to download that Guide to Organizational Change Management in the links in the description field below. So we've talked about software project management, talked about architecture, data and integration, change management. Now, last but not least, is business process reengineering. So this is the whole business process thread of how we're going to change our business processes and what those processes are going to look like in the future. And a lot of times people think, well, we don't need to do this because we're already doing it over here when we deploy new software. There's some truth that this is going to drive to some degree what your business processes will look like. But if you don't have sort of a top-down vision of what you want your processes to be, regardless of what technology you're deploying, then this is going to become a very aimless work stream that's going to get out of control, go over budget, take a lot more time than it should because you don't have clarity on what you want your business processes to be. Today's modern ERP systems are more flexible than ever, and even the simplest workflows that you would think would be standard, vanilla, off-the-shelf, out-of-the-box type of technologies are not so. There's a lot of different decisions that need to be made, and if you don't have clarity on what you want your processes to be, which is why this is so important, this work stream quickly gets out of control. This work stream is impacted. You have a lot of problems here from a human adoption perspective. This becomes difficult as well because now you don't have clarity on how you're going to integrate and leverage different technologies to improve your business processes. So this is a core fundamental aspect of an effective digital transformation. And here's where you define your current state processes. You don't want to spend a ton of time here, but you do need to understand where you are today, partly because part of what you do today in most organizations, there's value in there. A lot of times executives and organizations as a whole think, let's not worry about this because this is our future state over here. Let's focus on the future state. Fair enough. You want to focus on the future state, but you do need to understand where you're starting from because there's a lot of value and a lot of core competencies you've built over decades, if not longer, that you want to preserve. And then, of course, there's improvements you want to make. There's pain points. There's deficiencies in your current business processes that you want to focus on improving. You want to prioritize what those things are, where the real business value is, what the business case justification will be. All that is an important part of defining the current state, which then leads us to the future state. And this is exactly what it sounds like. This is us defining what our future state processes are so that now we can bridge the gap between current state and future state to do our change impact. Now we've got clarity on how we're going to deploy technology here and here, and it starts to pull together the entire transformation in that way. And then, of course, I mentioned a moment ago, you've got your business case. And this is where you quantify what the ROI is, what kind of business value you expect to get out of the transformation, where you're going to get the business value, and ultimately you use this as a tool to manage to business benefits realization as you go through the transformation and even after the transformation. Now, the reason this is so important is not only because you need to have clarity for business processes to help drive and enable some of these other work streams, but because it also gives you a lot of clarity and it gives you project governance and controls as it relates to PMO, or the Program Management Office. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So now we've talked about the different pieces of an overall program. We've talked about how software project management is different than some of these other work streams and why these other work streams are so important. But now you've got a lot of different work streams that need to be tied together. That's where program management comes into play. And again, this box is intentionally different than this box. You might have an SI or a system integrator, software vendor resource that is your technical project manager. They would fill this role here, but you still need someone up here that's providing the overall program management that now ties together all these different pieces. And so there's a few different components of program management here. One is making sure that we've got the project plans aligned across these different work streams. You've got a software vendor here that's going to come together with their proposal or their timeline of what they think the technical implementation looks like. You might have multiple software vendors doing the same thing if you have multiple systems you're deploying. You've got this piece, which is the architecture, data migration, integration, which is going to augment what's done here, and that's going to determine what the overall full plan looks like, as well as the full duration and timeline. Change management, of course, is its own animal. It's its own strategy that needs to be integrated with the overall transformation. And then, of course, business process improvement. And by the way, the things that are most likely to slow down a project and create disruption and cause a project to take longer than expected are these three right here. I don't want to say that this is rare, that you have delays or budget overruns here, but when it does happen, it's typically because there's issues over here that are affecting this piece here. So that's even more reason why you need a solid program management office to manage the entire program. Program management office is also important in terms of ensuring that we have project governance and controls in place. So I mentioned before how the business case is an important project governance tool because it gives us clarity and direction when we have a need to pivot or make decisions on what the project scope is going to be or where we might cut scope or add to scope. Someone has a customization request, someone wants to buy another module for technology. If we don't have this business case and ROI in place as sort of our guiding North Star for the transformation, we're going to be making these decisions based on gut feel and emotion. But here, with this in place, now we can make tangible business decisions on the rest of the project. Any changes that come along with the rest of the project, we can use this business case as a project governance tool to manage that entire thing. So essentially what the program management office is a way to tie together the entire operations or the entire set of work streams and the different projects within the overall program. And it's also a way to incorporate project governance with a project charter, the overall program plan, the business case, the overall vision and strategy for the project, the resourcing plan. All that stuff is really important from a program management perspective. And perhaps more importantly, and most importantly, is that by having this program management in place, this enables you, the implementing organization, not the system integrator, not the software vendor, but you, the implementing organization, you now have control and ownership of the overall program. And you should. This is your organization. You're deploying technology to improve your business, and you need that ownership and buy-in and support and control of the overall program. So what does this all mean to your digital transformation? Well, first of all, it means you want to open up your mind to look beyond software project management. And like I said at the beginning of this video, more often than not, software vendors and system integrators and value-added resellers, propose a plan that focuses right here. But your transformation typically will entail all this other stuff, including the program management. So you want to make sure you have a full program plan that integrates all these pieces. You also want to make sure you've got project governance in place and program governance in place, and that you ultimately staff this in a way that allows you to have ownership of the overall program. And perhaps most importantly, the reason program management is so important and why this is so important to you as an organization is it allows you to focus on the things over here that are more important to success than the technical implementation. This is important, don't get me wrong, but this stuff is ultimately more important, especially these two right here. If we do this stuff really well and this really well, then chances are pretty high that this, the software project management and the architecture, data, and integration work streams are going to come together better than if you hadn't focused on those things. Now that we understand how to plan for and execute on an ERP implementation, it's also helpful to understand why ERP projects fail. ERP implementation failure rates are extremely high. A lot of estimates put it at 80% or higher of ERP implementations failing, and that number hasn't really changed, and it definitely has not gotten better in the last 25 years that I've been doing this. So the question becomes why? Why do ERP implementations fail? Are we doomed for failure, or is there something we can do about it? And I would argue that there's something we can do about it, and that's what we're going to talk about next, is really unpacking the root causes of why ERP implementations fail so that ultimately you can identify those risks and mitigate those risks as you go through your project so that you're not surprised by it. You're not blindsided by these risks. Hopefully you can learn from others' mistakes to ensure that you are doing the things that need to be done to make your project successful and to avoid failure. The first common reason why ERP implementations fail is because organizations have unrealistic expectations to begin with. And the reason this is so powerful is because as fast as technology is changing and as much as technology can do today, it creates this false sense of hope that we as an organization can quickly adapt to this software and we can quickly realize business value from different technologies that are out there. And don't get me wrong, ERP software today can deliver dramatic value to most organizations. The problem is most organizations don't realize how difficult it is to get from where you are today to where you could be with new technology. And so, as a result, what ends up happening is not only do you have unrealistic expectations of how quick you might get to that business value, but when you realize that a project is going to take longer than you expect, it's going to cost more than expected, and require more resources than expected, what ends up happening then is that organizations end up scaling back and throttling back on some of the key critical success factors that are critical to make their project successful. For example, let's just say we have an organization that thinks they can go through their ERP implementation in 18 months. But 18 months was never realistic. It was always going to take this organization, say, 24 or 30 months to go through their implementation. What ends up happening is when the organization gets partway through that project, maybe halfway through or 2/3 of the way through, they start to realize that they have compressed a timeline that's just not at all realistic. So they have one of two choices. They can either delay the project and spend a lot more time and money than they expected, which oftentimes is not possible with boards of directors and other executives holding the project team accountable, or they can scale back on project activities and just try to force fit the ERP implementation into a shorter duration. When they do the latter, what ends up happening is they end up cutting things that are absolutely critical to success. They end up cutting things like organizational change management, or they'll cut a couple of iterations of user acceptance testing. They might spend a little bit less time on requirements gathering up front if they understand early on that they're behind the 8 ball on the timeline. So these are just a few examples of how organizations end up making a bunch of bad decisions later in a project because they had unrealistic expectations to begin with. So one of the biggest things you can do to ensure you avoid this pitfall is to ensure that you have realistic expectations, and do so by taking software vendor and system integrator and implementation partner proposals on a time frame and a budget. Take those with a grain of salt and make sure you add your own dose of reality from an objective perspective to ensure that you have the appropriate amount of time, budget, and resources dedicated to the project. The next common mistake that organizations make that lead them to failure is that they don't spend enough time and effort up front in the implementation planning process. And this is a fascinating organizational dynamic that I've seen time and time again throughout my career. What ends up happening is you get an organization that is committed to a digital transformation and an ERP implementation. They go through an evaluation process and they select the software that they are convinced will be the right answer for them going forward. And it probably is. It probably is the right answer, or a really good answer going forward. And it's at that point in the project that momentum and excitement for the project is the highest. It's never going to be that high again. So the team ends up rushing into the implementation because they're excited. They want to get started. They want to start building stuff. They want to see and touch and feel the technology. And that's all good stuff. You absolutely need to do that. But the problem with that is that when you jump too quickly into the implementation phase without having a really solid plan and a really solid vision of what it is you want to be when you grow up as an organization, you're going to spend a lot of time and money later on spinning your wheels trying to figure out what it is you want to be when you grow up when you're in the middle of an implementation. So the key here is to make sure you dedicate time in your project. It's sort of a phase zero, an implementation planning phase that's after the selection phase of the project, but it's before you get into the implementation. And taking that time to really establish a blueprint for the project, a blueprint for your business processes and what the organization is going to look like, which modules you're going to deploy and when, how you're going to resource the project, mobilizing the resources, getting your change strategy in place, all that stuff. The more time you spend doing that up front, you're going to save exponentially more time and money later on. So it's critical that you spend time defining this implementation phase. And to learn more about what this implementation phase should look like, I encourage you to check out this video right here. This video from my YouTube channel dives into the implementation planning and implementation readiness phase of the project in a lot more detail. And if you watch that video, it'll describe some of the different activities you should be focused on to avoid this common pitfall. Another common reason why ERP implementations fail is because executives don't have a clear vision, or they haven't articulated a clear vision of what it is this ERP implementation is going to be to the organization. Another common dynamic within this is that executive teams themselves oftentimes aren't aligned on what that vision is. And so when you have an executive team that doesn't have alignment amongst themselves, and or they haven't clearly defined and articulated to the organization what this ERP implementation means to the organization going forward, that's going to create a lot of problems, confusion, chaos, and misdirection as it relates to the ERP implementation. Now, a lot of times executives will say, well, we're going to go through this ERP implementation because we have to. Our software vendor is forcing us off our old legacy system, and now we need to move to a migration to a newer software. Or it could be that our old system is old, it's broken, we can't scale as a company, and therefore we need new technologies and tools to help us grow. Those are good starting points, but that cannot be the basis and the foundation for the entire justification for why you're going through the project. You need to have and articulate a clearer vision of what the ERP implementation is going to do for the organization. For example, is it going to help us improve our customer experience? If so, how? Is it going to improve the employee experience? If so, how? What are some of the details of how that will look? Is it going to help us improve our operations, help us be more efficient, help us sell more and generate more revenue? Whatever the business benefits are, you want to not only define what they are and what the value is to the organization, but get into more detail and granularity of what that operating model and that organizational model is going to be in that future state. It's not enough to say we're just going to deploy SAP or Oracle or Microsoft or whatever it is. You need to go beyond that and clearly articulate what the vision for the project is. And the more time and effort you spend defining this vision, and the more effective you are at defining that vision, the more tailwinds you'll have supporting you and the project team going through the ERP implementation. So one of the biggest things you can do to avoid ERP implementation failure is to ensure that before you get started on your implementation, that you have that clear alignment and vision from the executive team. One of the most common root causes for ERP implementation failure is a lack of focus on organizational change management. Or if there's a focus on organizational change management, it just isn't effective. This is one of the root causes that can lead to a lot of other symptoms within an ERP implementation. And simply put, if you don't address the people side of change, you don't ensure that your people are fully adopting new processes and new tools, you're just going to end up with a bunch of shelfware or investments in technology that is not delivering business value. And that has to lead you to the question of, why are we doing this project in the first place if we're not getting the business value that we could and should be getting from it? So the key here is to not get too caught up in the technology pieces and components of your ERP implementation, but instead to focus more time and effort on the organizational change management piece. Because the better job you do on organizational change management, the more likely it is you are to be successful. And when we look at ERP implementation failures, particularly as it relates to lawsuits that we've been hired to testify in courts, we find that the number one most common theme and pattern among those failures is a lack of organizational change management. The organization did not focus, for whatever reason, enough on organizational change. They didn't address the people aspects of change, and they focused too much time and effort on the technology sides of change. So one of the biggest things you can do is ensure that you have a solid and effective change management strategy and plan before starting your ERP implementation. Now, for more advice and tips on how to create that organizational change strategy and plan, I encourage you to check out my playlist, which you can find right here. It's a YouTube playlist that has all of my YouTube videos that talk about organizational change management. So check out this link right here. That'll give you a playlist that you can go through and watch some more videos that describe how to go about the change management process. Now, the fifth and final reason I'll talk about today of why ERP implementations fail is because the organization doesn't have a clear definition of success. How will we define success of our ERP implementation? For some organizations, it could be that we're going to come in on time and on budget. And that alone is a tricky proposition, and most organizations fail at even that most basic fundamental definition of success. But beyond that, most organizations don't have a good vision of what it is they want to get out of the ERP implementation after they've gone through it. In other words, what is our business case? What's the ROI? Where are we going to get the business value? Where are the dollars and cents going to come from? Those are all things that need to be defined clearly on, not only so that we can ensure that we maximize the business value post-implementation, but just as importantly, so that we have clear direction as we're going through the implementation itself. In other words, having that clear vision of success can serve as a sort of a guardrail for the project and a North Star that guides us in the right direction as we're going through the implementation. Every ERP implementation requires hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions about how your business is going to run, how it's going to look, what sorts of technologies you will or will not deploy, whether or not you're going to configure the software or customize the software or integrate it to other third-party systems. A lot of different decisions that materially affect the scope and the cost and the risk of the project. And if you don't have that clear vision for what it is success looks like for the project and what you want your organization to look like on the other side, then you're headed aimlessly into the darkness of digital transformation or an ERP implementation. So these are 5 of the most common reasons why ERP implementations fail. Now that we understand why ERP implementations fail, let's dive into some case studies and talk about why high-profile ERP implementations have failed in recent years. And this is a top 10 list we compiled not too long ago that dives into some of the highest profile, best known names in the industry that have struggled in their ERP implementations. And the reason these are such good case studies is because it gives us some examples and understanding of things we should not do in our ERP implementations. These are the mistakes that we should avoid. And so it helps to look at what other companies and specific case studies have done in their implementations that have led them to failure so that we can avoid those same things. So with that being said, let's dive into the next module, which gets into the top 10 ERP failures of all time. Coming in at number 10 is Haribo. They're the company that make gummy bears. Maybe number 10 on our list. It's actually number 1 on my kids' list because they love gummy bears, and they weren't happy to learn that gummy bears were largely unavailable for a period of time in 2018 after their SAP implementation. And the general gist and summary of what happened here is they spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to implement SAP. In 2018, they finally sort of implemented SAP, and immediately they ran into supply chain problems. They couldn't track where their inventory was. They couldn't track raw materials. They couldn't get the inventory to stores in time. And as a result, their sales dropped roughly 25% shortly after the transformation. So these problems are enough to land Haribo at number 10 on our list. Coming in at number 9 is Washington Community College. This company or this organization tried to implement PeopleSoft in 2012 or beginning in 2012, and they hired Cyber to help implement the product. And the tricky part and the unfortunate part of this project is that Cyber filed for bankruptcy and went out of business at the time of the implementation, and the college was left holding the bag and holding the end result, which wasn't pretty. So once Cyber went out of business, they were acquired by a company called HDC, who resumed the project, but they eventually canceled the project. And keep in mind, this is HDC, the vendor, canceled the project, not the college. The vendor canceled the project and sued the college for $13 million, saying that the reason that the project failed is because they had internal dysfunctions that couldn't be overcome. So this is a very rare situation where the failure was probably the result of both parties, but in this case, the system integrator was actually the one to sue the college. But in either case, the college spent a lot of time and money and now is dealing with a lawsuit in an implementation that's delivering little, business value to the college and to its students. Coming in at number 8 is Hewlett-Packard, the technology and hardware company. Now, Hewlett-Packard spent $160 million on their ERP project. The project cost $160 million, but the damages to the company that they claim were caused as a result of the failed implementation were nearly 5 times that amount. So they spent $160 million expecting to get a certain ROI, but in this case, they actually lost 5 times that amount, which isn't the type of ROI that most of us are looking for when we go to implement new technology. And one of the interesting quotes from the CIO of HP at that time, he said, "We had a series of small problems, none of which individually would have been too much to handle, but together they created the perfect storm." And that pretty well sums up what happens with a lot of these failures, and that certainly was enough to land Hewlett-Packard at number 8 on our list. Coming in at number 7 is Waste Management, another company that tried to implement SAP to no avail. And Waste Management spent around $100 million, according to public records, on their SAP implementation, and it ultimately failed. SAP had promised that Waste Management would get annual benefits somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 to $200 million per year, but those business benefits never materialized and resulted in a failure on the part of Waste Management. One of the key challenges that Waste Management alleges that they had with this project was that SAP misrepresented the software that was being offered to them, and they said that they were being demoed fake software. So the demos weren't the real software that SAP really had available, according to public records and quotes from people from Waste Management. So that was one of the interesting allegations, is that when Waste Management sued SAP, they alleged that SAP didn't demo properly the real software that they were actually going to be getting. Coming in at number 6 in our list is Hershey's. Hershey's tried to implement SAP. They spent quite a bit of money on their implementation, and what they found at the time of their go-live is that they were incapable of processing roughly $100 million of orders for Hershey's Kisses and Jolly Ranchers. And again, this is another one that may only be number 6 on our list, but it's definitely in my kids' top 3 because they love candy. So some of the problems that Hershey's ran into is that they tried to implement the product, the SAP product, in an unreasonably short period of time. And in fact, just from the outside looking in, it looks and sounds like it was never going to happen. And those unrealistic expectations caused the first domino to fall, which led to a lot of other problems later on throughout the implementation. And finally, one of the biggest mistakes, if not the biggest mistakes that Hershey's made along with their implementation partners, is that they decided to go live during a busy holiday season when chocolate is most readily bought by customers. And so this was a case where the implementation planning wasn't very well thought out, or if it was thought out, the risks were not well mitigated. And it's just a good reminder that we need to think long and hard about when we go live, how it affects our day-to-day business, as a way to ensure that we don't run into operational disruptions. Coming in at number 5 on our list is Miller Coors, the beer company, and they also struggled with their ERP implementation. They started their SAP implementation in 2013 and spent roughly $100 million on the project. And as a result of the implementation, they're suing their system integrator, which was HCL in this case, the Indian-based firm, and they're suing for $100 million in damages, trying to recover the damages that were resulting from this SAP implementation. Now, the really interesting thing about this, to add insult to injury, is that HCL's response publicly to the lawsuit was a bit flippant. Their response was, it's just one client. We have several other reference clients available for every one client that has something bad to say about us. So I wasn't involved in this project. I don't know the inside details, but it sounds a bit like there's some finger pointing going on there. But either way, it's something that could have been avoided, and we'll talk more at the end of this video on how to avoid some of those failures. But that's enough to land Miller Coors within our top 10. Number 4 is Revlon, the consumer product company. They had an SAP project recently, and the interesting thing about this is they announced it in a financial filing. That's how the news of the failure broke to the markets, and the markets didn't respond well. Their stock dropped about 6.9% the day after that filing and the announcement that their SAP project had failed. Now, just a little background on this, and this is really interesting. If you go read the financial filing and the SEC filing, they actually outline in a fair amount of detail what happened with this SAP implementation. So it's really interesting to go read. because they're basically explaining what happened and why it had the effect it did on the business. But in a nutshell, to paraphrase some of what they said in that filing, is that they first went live with one of their manufacturing plants in North Carolina. And the minute they went live, they weren't able to ship product. They lost customer orders. They lost visibility to their supply chain. And it essentially brought that plant to its knees, and it wasn't able to manufacture, distribute, or sell products anymore, at least in the short term, after the go live. And the other interesting thing is, because of some of those challenges, they had to expedite shipments. So as they were tracking customer orders and as customers were complaining about late orders, they were spending a lot of money expediting shipments for their customers. Another interesting aspect and another contributing factor to this failure is that at the time they were implementing SAP, they had just recently acquired the company Elizabeth Arden, and they were trying to figure out how they were going to integrate that company into the core Revlon operations at the same time they're trying to implement SAP. So here they are trying to implement a new technology. At the same time, they're just trying to figure out how to fit together all of their operations. And it created somewhat of a moving target, it sounds like, in terms of how that transformation was going to go. So when we talk about ERP successes or failures, one of the big indicators is ROI. What kind of return on investment did we get for the time and cost and money that we put into the implementation? In the case of Revlon, it wasn't so great. There's a negative ROI in the form of lost sales, lost customer value, or lost customer service. There is a intangible number that they didn't quantify, but they said that there was a material effect on the executive's time and the amount of time they had to spend trying to recover this and deal with all the problems that resulted from that implementation. So I don't know how you quantify that, but that sounds like it's pretty significant. There's also an increase in capital costs, increase in operating expenditures. They couldn't pay their vendors. They couldn't file their regulatory requirements and regulatory reports to the state and federal regulators. They had to expedite shipments, and they lost sales. So a lot of problems in that implementation. Number 3 on our list is Nike, the well-known consumer product company that many of you may buy from. And the company spent $400 million to upgrade their ERP systems recently. And that didn't go so well, obviously, or they wouldn't be on the list. But some of the business damages that resulted from the implementation were that the company had to take a loss of around $100 million, or they wrote off $100 million of that implementation. The stock price dropped by around 20%, according to one outlet that we reviewed in preparing for this. And the company had to invest another 5 years and another $400 million to get the project on track and to make the project successful. Now, from what we understand, again, outside looking in and what we see in the public forums, is it sounds like the project is back on track and they're getting value out of their ERP system. But the big question is, did they need to spend that much money? Was it worth the heartache? Could they have done it better? And could they have optimized the way that they went through the transformation? Coming in at number 2 is National Grid, the large utility company in the U.S. National Grid invested over $1 billion on their SAP implementation. And yes, I said $1 billion, not $1 million or any other number, but $1 billion plus on their SAP implementation, and it failed. The reason we can say with certainty that it failed were some of the results that they also publicly announced, and it was widely reported in the media as a result of their go live. Some of the metrics that came out of the company as a result were that, for example, the company had to spend $100 million in services to support the implementation after the fact. So after they went live, they spent another $100 million just supporting and stabilizing the system as it was rolled out. They also had 2 system integrators. They had Wipro involved, and actually they filed a lawsuit against Wipro. And you can find on my YouTube channel a whole video that talks just about the National Grid versus Wipro lawsuit. But they had Wipro, whom they sued, and they also ended up bringing in Ernst & Young, a second system integrator and a second expensive integrator, to help support the implementation because it wasn't going well with Wipro. By the end of the project, the company was spending about $30 million a month just supporting the project and trying to get the product up and running and to get through the implementation, which for any size company is just a ridiculous amount of money to be spending on trying to implement new technology. In addition, some of the end results of their operations after go live, their whole process for the period end close used to take 4 days before they rolled out the new ERP system. It took 43 days after they went live. So definitely a negative ROI there after spending all that money. And then finally, their post-go-live accounts payable processes resulted in about 15,000 unpaid supplier invoices that they just couldn't process and they couldn't pay. So they had a lot of suppliers and vendors that weren't very happy with them at the time. Coming in at number one on our list is the United States Navy. That is the military branch within the U.S. Military that spent over $1 billion on their ERP implementation since 1998. In fact, I think this project is still going on from what I understand. But at the time of the most recent data that was available, they had already spent over $1 billion on their ERP project. And they had three big system integrators helping them. They had IBM, they had Deloitte, they had EDS, who I think is no longer a business. But they had those three companies helping them. And according to a GAO report, which is a regulatory company that looks at accountability and oversight for the government, they put out a report saying that there were still no material improvements to the organization as a result of this $1 billion project. And the other interesting thing is that they had reduced the scope of the project to not be covering the entire supply chain and financials, but just to focus on the financial component of their business. So in other words, they cut from their scope the whole shipyard inventory management piece of it. And despite cutting the scope significantly, they still spent over $1 billion and still had trouble with the project, which, by the way, also affected 90,000 employees. So there are 90,000 employees that were stuck trying to deal with this new system that apparently didn't deliver a lot of value to the organization. And like I said, they are still implementing the product, and this is the reason why the U.S. Navy's ERP implementation comes in at number one on our list. So what gives? Why did these projects fail? And more importantly, what can we do to avoid this type of disaster? Or more likely, how can we avoid a more moderate failure that we're not going to read about in the news, but still becomes painful for our organization? How can we navigate those pitfalls? And what is it we can do to avoid this type of failure? Well, first is to choose the right software. Make sure you've got the right technology supporting your business and that you're not choosing software and implementing software in a biased way. The second thing is to choose the right system integrator. Make sure you have the right partner or partners helping you implement. Just because it's a big name or a well-known name system integrator doesn't mean that you're immune to failure or that you won't get fired or that your project won't fail. And if you look at the top 10 list here from today, you'll notice that there's a lot of big name system integrators and well-respected system integrators that were involved in those failures. And in some cases, they're involved in litigation as a result. Another thing to do is to remember that you are in charge of your project. This is your project. It's not the software vendors. It's not your system integrators. And you need to do what you need to do to make this project successful. If your system integrator isn't working out, course correct. Either give them clear direction on what you expect from them or fire them if you need to, bring in additional help, whatever it is you need. And also make sure that you're the one mitigating risks and identifying risks. System integrators generally aren't very good at mitigating risks and identifying where the risks are because they're the fox guarding the hen house, so to speak. So you need to have independent risk mitigation as part of this whole concept of making sure that you're in charge and you do what you need to do to make the project successful. The other thing to remember is that operational disruption is your biggest risk and potentially your biggest cost for the implementation. Too often companies will cut corners and step over dollars to pick up pennies. And what they'll do is they'll underinvest in things like organizational change management. They'll try to unreasonably compress the timeline and they'll cut the budget. And they'll do this all in the name of saving money and thinking that they're increasing ROI. But what they aren't looking at is what's going to happen on the other side when they go live and this materially affects their business. Generally, the companies that have operational disruptions find that money lost and spent after go live is a lot more damaging than the money they could have spent to get it right in the first place early on in the implementation. Another tip is to focus on business process management. Define what you want your business processes and your operations to look like. Define your business blueprint and let that drive your transformation. Don't fall into the trap of deferring to the technology and assuming the technology is going to allow you or help you figure out how to run your business. You need to determine how your business processes need to look. That will help you define how your technology can best support your business. Along those same lines, we should also be focused on user acceptance testing. Make sure that we thoroughly test the product and thoroughly test our business processes and really stress test the overall solution and the end-to-end business processes. Each of these failures shouldn't have happened, and they wouldn't have happened if they had a stringent and effective user acceptance testing process that would have identified these problems before they go live and it affects their business. So it gets back to the concept of you owning this, you running this as a business. User acceptance testing is no exception. It's something that could have been avoided had the companies been through the process and been effective in their user acceptance testing. So that's something that we recommend, that you have an independent third party, someone outside the system integrator, help navigate and help facilitate in your process. The next thing is executive leadership. Make sure that your executives are involved, they're bought in, they roll up their sleeves and help make some of the decisions that need to be made as part of the transformation, and that they are well informed of what's happening in the project and aware of the risks. That's a big problem that we see with executives, is they don't necessarily know what the risks are, partly because they're not being involved enough as they should be, but also partly because the project team either doesn't know or isn't sharing what some of the real risks are and some of those real decisions that need to be made and some of those decision trade-offs that need to be made as well. And then finally, make sure you have independent technology agnostic support to help you through the digital transformation. That's one of the best things you can do to ensure that you keep your project on track, you don't have the fox guarding the hen house, and that you're doing what's best for you as a business, not necessarily what's best for your software vendor or system integrator. Companies like our team at Third Stage is one such example that can help you through that transformation. So I hope this training course has provided you a deeper understanding of ERP systems, how to plan for an implementation, how to actually execute an implementation, and ultimately how to avoid failure, along with some of the case studies we've discussed here today. If you're looking for more information and more of a deep dive understanding and a takeaway from this training course, I encourage you to read two pieces of content that we made available to you. One is our annual Digital Transformation and ERP report, which is a report we publish each year, and it covers a number of independent reviews and rankings of different ERP systems, as well as some tips and lessons to make your ERP implementation more successful. You can find that and read that paper for free by scanning the QR code in front of you, or you can go to the links below. I also encourage you to read my new book called The Final Countdown. It's a book that talks about ERP implementations, digital transformations, how to be successful, how to plan for a successful implementation, and it takes a lot of the concepts we've talked about here in this training and goes even deeper in that book. So I encourage you to read that. You can buy the book by scanning the QR code in front of you, or you can simply go to thefinalcountdown.com. So I hope you found this information useful, and I hope you found this training course useful. Again, if you wouldn't mind sharing this with your colleagues, with your project team members, anyone else that you think might benefit from this training, I encourage you to do that. So I hope you found this useful and hope you have a great day.